Testing. Testing 1, 2. Alright, it looks like that worked. I have some numbing medicine for my teeth. Just I ate hard candy and hurt it. So my speech is a little bit messed up. It's mainly my lip. I got it on my lip and it feels funny. Okay, so while we wait for that to freaking pull up, let's see if this will work. Do 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 do. Think that works. Have her go down there. I think we're on chapter 3.
The beguiling. Night and the rain had both dearly, but then I'd have to.
I already did that one, so we're on chapter 4.
Echoes of the tomb.
There we go.
If there's one basic principle I've learned in over a century of rattling around the galaxy fighting the Emperor's enemies, whenever I couldn't avoid it, it's leave well alone. 3 simple words which have stood me in good stead over the years. Judiciously applied.
I will be right back. I gotta go check a print because I do not hear the printer going, so it must be done. Alright, let's see if it's done. The print is not done. The print has messed up. Due to like the USB itself being loose, the print will freeze. So I have to change out the USB and restart. And it's a 2-hour print, and apparently it's been 4 hours. So it's screwed up. Alright, so I was able to fix it. And let's get back to it while I try to pre-support all this stuff.
They've made my commissarial duties a great deal easier than they might have been. Unfortunately, it's a phrase the Adeptus Mechanicus seems incapable of grasping, a failing which almost cost me my life. I suppose I'd better explain. By the end of 928, my undeserved reputation for heroism had grown to such a ridiculous level that I'd finally attracted the attention of the upper echelons of the commissariat, who decided that a man of my obvious talents was wasted in the posting to an obscure artillery unit I had so carefully arranged for myself in the hope of being able to sit out my lifetime of service to the Emperor, a long way away from any actual fighting. As it turned out, by sheer bad luck, I'd managed to put myself in harm's way an inordinate number of times, emerging on every occasion trailing clouds of undeserved glory, so that to the sector at large I seemed to be the very epitome of the swashbuckling hero that commissars are generally considered not to be. Most regiments regard us as something akin to the engineers in the transport pool, sometimes necessary, occasionally useful, generally best avoided. Accordingly, I found myself transferred to a desk job at brigade headquarters, which at first seemed like a gift from the Emperor himself. I had a nice, comfortable office with an anteroom in which Jürgen, my aide, was able to lurk, deterring all but the most determined of visitors with his single-minded devotion to following orders as literally as possible and his paint-blistering body odor. For a while, it seemed that my days of fleeing in terror from gene-stealers, chaos cultists, and blood-maddened orcs were over. But of course, it was all too good to be true. The staff officers were delighted to discover that they had a bona fide hero among them. At least, so they believed, which meant every time they needed an independent commissar to accompany some particularly dangerous or foolhardy mission, they sent for me. Thanks to my finely honed instinct for self-preservation, I managed to make it back every time, though this only encouraged them to think I was the greatest thing since Macarius, and just the man to send out on an even more dangerous assignment just as soon as they could think of something sufficiently lethal. Enough was enough, I decided. And hearing that someone was needed to liaise with an Astartes company which was campaigning alongside the Guard in a routine action to clear some heretics off an agri-world on the spinwood fringes of our sector, decided to volunteer for the job. After my last little jaunt, rescuing some hostages from an Eldar pirate base, I thought a bit of quiet diplomacy would be just the change of pace I needed. "You don't think you'll find this sort of thing a little tame?" General Locris, a genial old buffer I'd probably quite like if he didn't keep trying to get me killed, asked, raising a shaggy white eyebrow in my direction. We were dining together in his private chambers, the skill of his chef more than making up for the tedium of his company, and I had a shrewd suspicion that this demonstration of his regard was intended to sway me into changing my mind. I took another mouthful of the salma, which was poached to perfection, to give myself time to formulate an acceptable answer. "Well, it's got to be more interesting than shuffling data files," I said, smiling ruefully. That fitted his mental image of Cain, the man of action, quite nicely, and he nodded sympathetically. "Besides," I went on, seeing no harm in laying it out with a trowel, "how often am I going to get the chance to go into battle alongside the Astartes?" Never, if I had anything to do with it, but Locris didn't need to know that. He nodded eagerly at the prospect, quite enthused on my behalf, and took an extravagant pull at his wineglass to restore his composure. "Quite right, my boy. What an experience that would be." He sipped at his drink again, growing quietly contemplative. "By the Emperor, if I were 100 years younger, I'd volunteer myself." "It's not as though there's anything urgent I need to do here," I went on. "Jürgen can take care of the routine stuff while I'm gone." I would have preferred to take him with me, of course, but I was uncomfortably aware of the impression he was bound to make on the genetically enhanced supermen of the Astartes, and had no wish to undermine my credibility before the assignment had even begun. Besides, while he was here, he could watch my back, making sure I wasn't earmarked for any more suicide missions. I knew something was in the wind, which was why I'd seized on this diplomatic assignment so eagerly. For once, whatever Lochris and his cronies were planning, they could leave me out of it. "You should reach the Viridian system in about a month," the General said. "I don't suppose the heretics will be able to hold out for much longer than that, but even if they do, you ought to be back here by around 200 next year at the latest." "Emperor willing," I said, making a mental note to spin the assignment out for longer than that if I could. He might not have a specific reason for wanting me back by then, but you never know. My first surprise was the transport ship I'd been assigned to. Instead of a troop ship or a supply vessel, both of which I was intimately acquainted with after all my years of shuffling from one war zone to the next, I found my shuttle docking at a light freighter bearing the unmistakable sigil of the Adeptus Mechanicus. They seemed to be expecting me. There was an honor guard of their augmetically enhanced troopers lining the walls of the hangar bay, and a tech priest with a wide smile and a couple of mechadendrites waving lazily over his shoulders was waiting at the bottom of the shuttle's exit ramp. He stuck out a hand for me to shake as I descended, and on taking it, I was surprised to find it was still unaugmented flesh. "Commissar Kane," he said, "welcome aboard. I'm Magos Killian, leader of the expedition, and this really is a tremendous honor. We've heard all about you, of course, and I must say we're thrilled to have you traveling with us."
There we go.
"Expedition?" I said, trying to ignore the sudden lurching sensation in the pit of my stomach. I was under the impression I'd been assigned to liaise between the guard units and the Reclaimers task force in the Viridia system. "Didn't they tell you?" Confusion, exasperation, and amusement chased themselves across Killian's face. "Well, that's the Munitorum for you, I suppose. We're making a rendezvous with the Reclaimers battle barge in the Interitus system, so some clerical drone obviously thought it would save you a bit of time to hitch a lift with us and transfer across when we need them." He fished a data slate from some recess of his immaculate white robes and fiddled with it for a moment. "The next scheduled departure for Viridia is in another 3 weeks. Allowing for the wait before the barge arrives in orbit around Interitus Prime, you should be there about..." He consulted the slate again, making a couple of quick calculations as he did so. "About 36 hours ahead of them, if the warp currents are favorable, of course." "Of course," I said. I wasn't sure whether to be relieved or angry. On the one hand, I'd be spending an extra 3 weeks on a roundabout voyage to Emperor knew where, but on the other, that was 3 weeks I wouldn't have to worry about Lochris and his friends trying to find some new and inventive way of getting me killed. On balance, that was an acceptable trade-off, I felt. I smiled and nodded with every appearance of polite interest I could summon up. "I'm looking forward to hearing all about this expedition of yours." A servitor scuttled past me and up the ramp of the shuttle to retrieve my kit bag, which from habit I'd left lying where it was on the subconscious assumption that Jurgen would deal with it. Killian nodded with every indication of eagerness as we strolled past the line of tech guards, every one of them immaculate, hellguns at the port. They looked formidable enough on parade, I found myself thinking, but I was by no means sure their fighting prowess would be a match for real guardsmen. As it turned out, I was to see for myself how effective they were before very long, and if I'd realized that at the time, and against how terrible a foe, I would certainly have thanked the tech priest politely for his offer and bolted for the shuttle without a second thought. But of course I didn't, so I simply strolled along beside him, blithely unaware that we were all on a voyage to perdition. Despite my forebodings, the trip itself turned out to be remarkably pleasant. In striking contrast to the basic conditions aboard the troop ships I was used to, the Omnissire's blessing felt more like a luxury liner. I had a well-appointed stateroom assigned to me, with a couple of hovering cyber skulls humming quietly in the corner with nothing better to do than scoot off to find anything I required, and the cuisine was first-rate. A real surprise this, as in my experience, tech priests tend not to worry about that sort of thing, looking on the necessity of taking in regular nourishment as a distasteful reminder of their fleshly origins or some such nonsense.
Hello, an old beggar. Thanks to joining me. I'm trying to slice this file right now.
Something equally unappetizing the first time I wandered down to the mess hall, only to find a pleasantly appointed dining room which wouldn't have looked out of place in a smart hotel. and was immediately assailed by the
so it's
mouth-watering
this
odour
one
of
that's the issue.
sautéed grox. I was still enjoying my first meal aboard when Killian ambled over. A plate of grox and fresh vegetables in one hand, a large bowl of Ackenbury sorbet in the other, and a steaming mug of recaf waving precariously from a mechadendrite. I gestured for him to join me, and after a few preliminary pleasantries, he began to chat about their voyage.
See how
No
much more
reason
I
you
put
shouldn't
left.
at least know where you're going, he said cheerfully, the unoccupied mechadendrite diving into the recesses of his robe for the data slate. He placed it on the table and continued to manipulate the controls with the mechanical limb while his real ones plied knife and fork with evident enthusiasm. A star chart appeared, the Viridian system just at the fringes of the display, and a small sullen stellar revenant centered in the screen. Looks inviting, I said with heavy irony. To my surprise, Killian chuckled. Does rather, doesn't it? He said, zooming the display so that the target system filled the screen. A handful of dark and airless worlds orbited the decaying star, seared to cinders when it went nova millions of years before, taking whatever life had
so
existed there into oblivion before sinking back into the sullen, cooling ember about
what's
which the
one's...
few surviving rocks still drifted.
Oh.
This is the Interitus system, he said. Well named, I'm sure you'll agree. I nodded. I can't for the life of me see what you'd want there, I admitted, let alone why an Astartes chapter would divert a battle barge from a war zone to meet you. Killian positively beamed and pointed to the largest chunk of rock in the system. This is Interitus Prime. The whole system
Thank
was
you for
surveyed by
joining me.
explorators back in the 28th
I'm
millennium,
just
in the most cursory
listen.
fashion, I may add, if the
1
surviving
second.
records are anything to go by.
Yeah, recommended you. Well, hey, at least YouTube realizes I have a channel now. Yeah, I'm listening to a Kane audiobook for Warhammer while I do some 3D printing. I'm trying to set all this up, so all I have to do is click on the bed plate, press enter, and it'll print it while I'm at work or something. I'm listening to a Kane audiobook while we do this, and after this is done, I'm gonna play Untitled Goose Game. Yeah, not too much. Just trying to do a relaxing stream thing to do, play in the background, you know. And if anyone wants to listen to the audiobook, they can play the YouTube live streams in the background. You know, boost my views. My speech and stuff is a little funky right now because I have some toothache medicine on, so it's a little weird. Oh, you actually you watched some of my videos. Thank you. I usually have a smaller channel just because avoid people, and I work late, so I'm usually stream at like midnight to like 2 in the morning, and my schedule allows me to do that. So yeah, I'm working on a 3D print for uh, what was it called? Trench Crusaders. This is one of the Pilgrims' helmets. Yeah, dental work isn't fun. I had a root canal when I was in my teens. It, the medicine worked for me really well. I didn't feel a thing until the next day when my face was so swollen, and I freaking was sick for like a week, it felt like. But hey, I didn't have to go to school. So I'm going to get back to it, and if you want to talk about anything, just uh, see if I can move this. Yeah, here's your chat, so I can at least see chat. It's over here on my second monitor. Okay, come on. There we go. So yeah, I can just look over and watch what you say. So I'm gonna start Kane again, and we can get back to it.
Bye. Your records go back that far? I couldn't keep an edge of incredulity from my voice. That was the all but unimaginable golden age, when the Emperor still walked among men and the Imperium was young and vigorous, its domination of the galaxy uncontested instead of being riven by heresy and threatened on all sides by malevolent powers. Killian nodded. Only in the most fragmentary form, of course, but there are still tantalizing hints for those prepared to meditate for long enough upon them and put their trust in the benevolence of the Omnisire. And you think there's something there worth going after? I said. There wasn't much which would drag a ship full of cogboys halfway across the sector, and it wasn't hard to guess which item on that very short list was the attraction here. Some significant stash of archaeotech, perhaps? Perhaps. Killian nodded, evidently pleased at my perspicacity. We won't know for sure until we get there, will we? I suppose not, I conceded, turning my attention to the desserts. The rest of the voyage passed pleasantly enough, although apart from Killian, I had little to do with the tech priests on board. For company, I gravitated naturally to the tech guards, with whom I had a little more in common, finding that despite their augmetic enhancements and a devotion to the cult of the machine, which I found a trifle disconcerting, I've little enough patience with Emperor botherers at the best of times, let alone ones who seem to think he runs on clockwork. They were as disciplined and professional in their way as any of the warriors I'd served with. Moreover, they'd heard of me and believed every word of my reputation. Their only drawback from my point of view was that they didn't seem to have any currency, being some sort of vassals of the Adeptus, so there wasn't much point in getting my tarot deck out.
15 hours.
Their commanding officer, a Lieutenant Tarkus, was a keen regicide player, however, and a hard opponent to beat, so I was able to keep my brain ticking over while the ship scuttled nervously through the warp towards whatever might be lurking at our destination. It was Tarkus who finally put my mind at rest about the battle barge. It seemed that despite my obvious concerns, its formidable firepower wasn't to be deployed in our defense. Omnisire, no, he said, casually dispatching one of my lancers with a sudden flanking movement I should have seen coming. It's on way to clean out the rebel base on Viridius Secundus. I nodded gravely, pretending I'd read the briefing slate about the tactical situation in the Viridia system. It seemed the heretics had taken control of more than just the main world then. They're only hooking up with us long enough to transfer a squad of space marines over, and to pick you up, of course. Well, that was something, although a potential threat potent enough to require an Astartes squad to contain wasn't to be taken all that lightly. I consoled myself with the reflection that it wasn't my problem anyway. I'd be safe aboard one of the most powerful vessels in space and a long way from Interitus Prime before anyone started to meddle with whatever chunk of archaeotech the cogboys were after. I nodded judiciously, playing for time, and made a feint with a trooper, hoping to draw his ecclesiarch out of position. I'm sure you'll feel safer having them around, I said blandly. Can't be too careful after all. As I'd hoped, the half of his face which wasn't made of metal
Yeah, I played Helldivers too. I haven't played in a few months thanks to my job, and they did that update thing, and it kind of just killed it all for me. Back when they were trying to make you have a PSN account. Yeah, it just killed Helldivers for me. And then I started this new job, so I haven't really been playing it.
colored visibly as he considered the implied slur on his command, and he moved a little too hastily, creating an opening I should be able to exploit a couple of moves further on in the game. I don't see why that'd make a difference, he said, a little too levelly. My boys can cope with anything the galaxy might throw at us. I don't doubt it, I said. From what I've seen, we could do with a few more like them in the Guard. Tarkus nodded as I moved my portside citadel, setting up what I hoped would be a chance to win in another 3 turns. I waited until he was considering his response before adding, but Magos Killian obviously doesn't share my confidence. Tarkus almost knocked his ecclesiarch over as he picked it up and moved it, blowing his only chance of blocking my next attack. His jaw clenched. It's not a question of confidence, he said. There are long-standing obligations. I perked up at that, as you can imagine, although what sort of pact there might have been between an Astartes chapter and the Adeptus Mechanicus, I was at a loss to understand. I don't doubt that I would have been able to worm a little more out of Targus given time, but I decided not to press him any further that evening, having just set myself up for a comfortable win despite his superior skill at the game and wanting to savour it. And by the time we'd agreed on for our next joust across the board, he was already dead. Well, there it is. Killian waved an expansive hand at the armorcrest window, which dominated the far end of the ship's lounge. Beyond it, the dying star guttered fitfully, casting a dim blue glow over us which reminded me of autumn twilight. A slice of darkness distorted the glowing sphere, the bulk of the planet we'd come so far to reach, rising up to take a bite out of it. The landscape below us was in darkness, but enough of the wan glow of the system's primary leaked across the horizon for me to make out a blasted wasteland, cracked by heat almost impossible to imagine, and riven with impact craters. That alone was a testament to how old this place was, as it must have been left almost smooth by its fiery transformation. The pockmarking of its face would have been the work of eons. Despite the awful bleakness of the prospect, I couldn't deny that it had a desolate grandeur to it, and a faint chill akin to awe touched my soul as I took it all in. It's certainly impressive, I agreed. Nonetheless, a vague sense of unease took hold of me, and I found myself grateful for the thought that I'd be transferring to the Reclaimer's battle barge and leaving this system forever within a day or two. We've already begun to establish our base camp, Killian continued. I strained my eyes in the direction he'd pointed, failing to see anything.
I might play it sometime. Uh, I just, like I said, I haven't because I work 12-hour shifts and my schedule is basically like opposite of everybody I play with. I actually do have a Discord for that, but I don't know if I would drop the Discord ever because it's like my personal friends and family. And I'm not gonna make a Discord for like my YouTube uh, just because I don't I don't want to have to deal with random people. If that makes sense. Uh, I would play. I don't know, man. Uh, it just it has to be something I have to be very in the mood for. How many pieces? Oh right, I need 104 of these. Oh, three. Press OK. This is gonna take a minute. But yeah, I would totally be down to play sometime. We don't use the in-game chat just because of how it works. Uh, I use the Discord. It's I might make it like a personal DM, but I don't know how I would even message or invite people from YouTube. Oh, that I'm not printing these pegs yet. That's actually crap. I'm not printing these yet, so crap. I should. Dang it! I'm gonna clone one, and move it to the other build plate. This way we can test it over here. That way we can test it on that one.
for a moment, then picked out a faint flash of light as one of our shuttles ignited its engine many kilometers below. I think you'd be impressed. No doubt I would, I agreed, grateful for the secrecy he'd displayed up to now, which almost certainly meant I wouldn't have to leave the security of the ship. But I'm sure you don't want me getting underfoot. Well, Killian hesitated, clearly torn between conflicting impulses and not entirely sure whether he was doing the right thing. Obviously, we're on a mission from the Omnisire. Normally, we wouldn't dream of involving an outsider. Here it comes, I thought, with an ominous sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. That reputation for heroism is about to hit me over the back of the head again. The tech priest cleared his throat. But given your extensive experience as a military man, do you think Lieutenant Tarkus would listen to your opinions at all?
How many printers I actually have? Technically, I have one Bamboo SP1. I have a Anycubic Photon Mono X 6K, two Anycubic Photon Mono X's, a Anycubic Photon Zero, which was my first printer. It was $115, and a Photon Mono S or Photon S, and like uh, if you can guess, like each one gets bigger and bigger and improves each time. Um, the only brand new one I bought was the Photon Zero and the Photon Mono X6K. The rest I bought from Facebook Marketplace. Slowly upgrading. And actually, I just got a notification that the biggest printer I've ever had is actually being shipped. It's the, was it GK3 from, I don't remember. Crap. Who makes it, but it's freaking huge and has like a 14K screen, but it's like equivalent to like 8K, but because of how big it is. But that means I can print my Imperial Knights and Titans on one build plate, which I'm excited for. Because that also means I can do my cosplay. The Jupiter? What is the Jupiter? Um, oh, this thing? Or is it an FDM? The Algu Jupiter? I guess that could work. Still sounds nice. Um, yeah, it's 20 pounds heavier. uh, yeah, I started 3D printing back in 2014, 2015 because my high school had an engineering program, and I joined that program for the 3D printer. Excuse me, but the printer never worked until like 2017, 2018, the year I graduated. They bought a brand new 3D printer that actually worked. But it was like 20 grand at the time, and now you can go and buy it for like $500. Nice. You got yours on sale. Yep, that's the best way. I got the Mono X because it was $250 and had a magnet plate already attached and like still in the box. The guy had bought them and thought it would be easy, and he didn't realize he needed all this other stuff to clean the resin, and just switched it out for a FDM printer. Because resins for detail, FDMs for strength, and he needed strength. Also, yeah, a kid. Yeah, I do commission work, and that's what this is. Um, I'm printing proxies for Warhammer. I'm going to be printing cosplay helmets, like example, and I'm going to be printing core for myself. And I'm trying to get backers to help sponsor a print farm eventually, to where I want to 3D print a car, a Imperial Knight, like 1-to-1 scale Imperial Knight from Warhammer. But before the Imperial Knight, I wanted to print a life-size Dreadnought, and I'm trying to get a robotics guy from YouTube to help me out with that. Because imagine a 1-to-1 scale Dreadnought from Warhammer that actually walks.
Lieutenant Tarkus strikes me as a man who doesn't need much advice from anyone, I said smoothly, cursing myself for undermining his confidence the previous evening. And if he does, I'm sure the Astartes contingent will have far more pertinent comments to make when they get here than anything I might have to say. Well, that's the thing, Killian coughed delicately again. Technically, they'll be led by a sergeant, won't they? Of course. And Tarkus would be too stubborn.
Mars pattern, I've seen those. Yeah. I want to print like a 1-to-1 scale uh, Dreadnought eventually. Like 10 feet tall, 10 feet wide, just massive giant machine. And I want to make it actually walk. Uh, a Hulk from Helldivers. I, I'm not sure. Is that the like Space Hulk, the like spaceship, or am I? I've not played in so long. Am I missing something?
To ask the opinion of a low-ranking squad leader, now his pride had been hurt. Notwithstanding the fact that the Space Marine sergeant would probably have decades of combat experience and refuse to take orders from anyone outside his chapter in any case. I had a sudden premonition of the administrative problems which would be awaiting me on Viridia, and wondered for a moment if I'd done the right thing in volunteering. Oh well, I might as well get a little practice in now. I had nothing better to do until the barge arrived after
Oh,
all.
that thing. Okay.
I'll do my best to help, of
It's the thing
course,
that looks like a
I said.
dreadnought.
Perhaps if I had a little chat with him? Would you? Killian snagged a plate of canapes from a passing servitor and offered me one. We'd be very grateful. He's an admirable young man, of course, but rather headstrong. Where is he? I asked, biting into the delicacy. Still in his quarters? Omnisire, no. Killian smiled and gestured towards the planet below. He's down there. As it happened, that was a stroke of luck which was to save my life. But I had no idea of that at the time, so spent the shuttle ride down to the surface of Interitus Prime, feeling resentful at being dragged off on a pointless errand. Technically, I had no authority over Tarkus in any case, since he wasn't a member of the Imperial Guard, but Killian didn't seem to think that would matter. Sure that the young officer would be sufficiently impressed with my fraudulent reputation to listen to whatever advice I might have to offer. He was also very grateful for my assistance, as he kept telling me from the adjacent seat as we descended, and in the end I found myself feigning interest in the desolate landscape below, just to shut him up for a minute or two. Truth to tell, after a while my interest was becoming genuine, even if it remained somewhat muted. The closer we got to landing, the more forbidding that airless landscape became. Smaller craters becoming visible as we got closer to them, and faint spider webs of shadow swelling into chasms deep beyond measure and wide enough to swallow a hive block. The shuttle continued to descend, and I began to wonder whether the pilot was paying attention to the altitude, despite knowing it to be a servitor, which could by its very nature be nothing but vigilant. There was still the faint possibility of malfunction, of course, and I began to tense subconsciously, waiting for the retros to kick in. But they never did. Aren't we getting a little close to the ground now? I ventured after a while, and Killian smiled lazily. I suppose we are, he said, showing no sign of concern. Well, I wasn't going to make a fool of myself in front of the Magos, so I simply shrugged with the best expression of casual indifference I could summon up. Thought so, I said. A few moments later, the reason for his lack of concern became evident to me. A grey haze in the distance, which I'd taken for the horizon, began to close in on us, looming over the slowly descending shuttle like a thunderhead, and I nodded in sudden understanding. We were sinking gently into one of those titanic rifts in the planet's surface, already at least a couple of 100 meters below ground level. How far down does this go? About 800 kilometers, Killian said casually. It's the deepest chasm on the planet. He produced a flask of something from the depths of his robe with his right hand, the mechadendrites pulling out a cup apiece. So we've got time for a recap before we land, if you like. I did like. Under the circumstances, I thought I deserved one. The dim illumination of the dying star above had dwindled to nothing by now, but the running lights of the shuttle were enough to let me pick out a few of the details of that incredible fissure. Layer after layer of different strata slipped past the porthole, subtle graduations of hue marking the ticks of some long wound-down geological clock, and a couple of times I thought I caught a glimpse of something white, fossils perhaps, of creatures already extinct for millions of years before their planet died in its turn. The thought was a morbid one, and I tried to turn my mind away from the contemplation of death and eternity with casual conversation. I can see why you think this place is so special, I ventured after a while. It's quite... I tried in vain to think of a suitable adjective before concluding somewhat lamely with impressive. Killian chuckled throatily. I have to say that of all the tech priests I've ever met, he was by far the most likable, as well as the most untypical of his kind. Factors which were probably not unconnected, come to think of it. I think we can still surprise you, Commissar. At that point, I rather doubted it, to be honest, although I have to concede that he was right. My first presentiment that there was even more to this chasm than at first met the eye was a faint glow from below us, which soon resolved itself into the actinic glare of several gigantic luminators set on pylons around a makeshift landing pad. Our shuttle settled gently in what seemed to be the exact center of the flattened area, and Killian bounced from his seat with every sign of eagerness to get outside. It was only as he hit the rune to lower the exit ramp that I remembered the world was airless. "Wait a minute!" I called, struggling up from the deeply padded seat which suddenly seemed a lot less comfortable now that I needed to stand in a hurry. He might have some augmetic enhancements that let him manage without air, but I most certainly didn't. Killian smiled at me. "I told you you'd be surprised," he said as the seals broke with an audible hiss, but it was the sound of equalizing pressure, I realized with a sudden surge of relief, having become all too familiar with the sound of explosive decompression when the Hand of Vengeance took a torpedo volley amidships at the siege of Perlia. Thin, cold air began to seep into the shuttle, leaching the warmth away with tendrils of mist. Having spent most of my career with Valhallan units who like their air conditioning turned up to the maximum, I found the chill bearable, but oddly dispiriting. "I am," I admitted. "I didn't think you'd been here long enough to create an atmosphere." I followed him down the ramp, my boots crunching gently on the gravel beneath, which had something of the texture of ash. "We haven't." Killian was rubbing his hands together, although whether for warmth or for enthusiasm I couldn't tell. Probably both. "So the survey reports were right about that, at least." "So why haven't the gases frozen?" I asked. "Even if the feeble sun were warm enough to prevent them turning to ice, it never penetrated this deep below the surface, and the world was too long dead to have any residual heat left in its core." My breath puffed the words into little clouds as I spoke, although Killian's, I noticed absently, did not. "Exactly," Killian said, as though I were his favourite pupil, and led the way between the two nearest luminator gantries, following a clearly defined trail in the brittle ground. Once we were beyond the glare, my eyes adjusted, and I could make out a cluster of dimmer lights on the walls of the chasm. There has to be something else down here emitting energy. It's the only explanation. I was intrigued in spite of myself, I don't mind admitting it. As we approached the lights, I could see they were suspended in the mouth of a vast
Printed one
cavern,
piece?
with servitors
No,
scuttling
I've
about,
printed like
reinforcing the
4
makeshift
pieces.
ramp of broken shale
It's
leading up to
actually
it.
on my YouTube
I'll
channel. I
never
just
know if
uploaded it.
Killian's enthusiasm would have led him to expound further on what he was after, or if he would have realized he was revealing Adeptus' secrets to an outsider and clammed up again, because at that point, a young
Excuse me.
tech priest appeared in the cave mouth, gesticulating wildly. Magos, he called, practically jigging up and down on the spot with excitement. We've found something. Without even pausing to ask what it was, Killian picked up the pace and practically ran inside the gaping hole in the cliff face, which was large enough to have taken our shuttle with room to spare. Not wanting to lose my guide, I trotted after him, more than a little intrigued. Killian barely slowed at any of this, hurrying on into the darkness which surrounded that scene of activity. Red uniformed tech guards were hovering deferentially at the fringes of the illuminated area, and I made a mental note to suggest to Tarkus that they be redeployed a little further out, where their eyes would be adjusted to the surrounding gloom and better able to distinguish any infiltrators moving in on the bustling researchers.
Yeah, the camera's
Of
built in
course,
the
there
printer.
didn't seem the remotest chance of anyone else being here, and for all I knew, they had
It's actually
augmetic
why we
eyes
bought
which
it,
could see
because it's
perfectly well in the dark
self-leveling
anyway. But by
and
that
the
stage in my career,
time
I
lapse.
was already beginning to acquire the healthy sense of paranoia, which has probably done more than anything else to ensure my survival long enough to reach an honourable retirement. Plunging into the gloom after him, I found the way easy enough to negotiate despite the lack of illumination, as he was making more noise than an orc in a distillery. Another patch of light was visible in the distance, and I hastened towards it, picking out a cluster of white robes and red uniforms without difficulty. Peculiar circle and stick markings were embossed on the far wall, and as I moved closer, it became obvious that the surface here was worked to a glossy smoothness, which somehow seemed to swallow the light falling on it. These sigils are undoubtedly of Necrontyr origin, a tall, cadaverous tech priest was saying as I entered the circle of brightness.
Oh geez, that
He broke off to
sucks.
glare at me, until Killian gestured to him to continue. The name meant nothing to me at the time, of course, although when I finally reported back to Locris, he showed me some highly classified files which did nothing at all to make me feel better. I suppose he thought if something was going to try that hard to kill me without him instigating it, the least he could do was let me know what it was. This is all very interesting, Brother Stadler, Killian said with every sign of impatience. But what about the artifact? It's over here, Stadler said after a moment, during which I'd made it abundantly clear that I wasn't moving. The circle of light surrounding us shifted a little, moved by some techno-sorcery I wasn't privy to, revealing the mouth of a tunnel. Like the wall it penetrated, the archway was perfectly smooth, composed of stone blocks of an eerie, glossy blackness
Just
which
a
only
black
served
fortress.
to intensify the darkness beyond. We started down the tunnel hoping to find more hieroglyphs and stumbled over this. He permitted himself a wintry smile. Quite literally, in the case of our escort. A couple of red uniformed figures.
Wait. Dang it. So it does have a pretty cool resin pump though that empties and fills the vat automatically and keeps it filled if needed. Yeah, that would be nice if I didn't print so much. Like I'm in there anyway, so I just refill it when I need to. Also, the pump wouldn't handle the. I got the 3-liter bottles of resin at a time, like big bottles, and I figured out my own personal mix for it. So if I take the standard gray and mix in like a 3-to-1 mixture, like 3 liters standard to 1 liter of regular of ABS resin, it actually makes it all pretty hard and nice and tough. But if I just add a few drops of alcohol-based ink dye from Mod Podge, or more like 18 to 16 drops of it, the alcohol in it reacts with the resin enough to soften the UV resin, and it makes it the color itself. The UV interacts with the color, and it actually smoothly like makes it a lot smoother and the color pops so you can see where the layer lines are a little bit better. Yeah, I did all right. So I'm actually trying to figure out how to get a webcam to work. So eventually, I'm gonna have a webcam painted at pointed at my desk so I can do paintings and live streams. Where is this poking off? Oh, it's right there at the tip. Yeah, there we go. If that goes there, I wonder if I can fit this one over there. Do do do. Oh, is that Helldivers? Nice. I actually saw a picture of the cars. I'm like, when that happen? Because I knew that a hacker had gotten in and like had been getting them out early, and people were telling the game creators about it, and they were like, the response was, "Yeah, we don't care as long as he's not breaking the game." Like that, basically that whole PSN account thing was like the worst thing I've heard about Helldivers, besides the repetition. But if you have a good gaggle of friends, the repetition isn't that hard, and it's actually pretty fun.
Emerged from the gloom, the scowl on Tarkus's face enough to tell me who the tech priest was referring to. The trooper with him was walking backwards, his hellgun aimed at something still in the darkness beyond, and a moment later, a couple of tech priests appeared, leading something metallic between them. It was big. I could tell that even before it came into the light, supported by a dozen cyber skulls which had managed to wedge themselves into the interstices of its body. A small, detached part of my mind noted that the cogboys at least must be able to see in the dark, as there was no sign of illumination further back. Remarkable. Killian looked like a juvie on Emperor's Day morning who's just seen the toy soldiers he always wanted at the top of
Nice.
his
I've
bow.
been looking forward to
I
the
could have
Max
thought of a number
and
of other
cars.
adjectives to describe the thing, starting with hideous and growing steadily more pejorative. It resembled nothing so much as a metallic sump spider, although even one of those would have seemed cuddly by comparison. Mechanisms protruded from its head, and 6 limbs dangled from its bloated body.
All right, so what this Kane story is just a bunch of his little stories put together. Um, and this one, he is obviously landed on a planet that's a black stone fortress from the Necrons. Oh, you're already on my Discord. All right. Yeah, I didn't realize it was you. I can actually invite you to my personal Discord if you wanted.
Even inert, it exuded a palpable malevolence which wrapped itself around me like a suffocating blanket. What have we here? Killian bent over it, probing with the mechadendrites. Looks like a power core. Completely inert, of course. He shrugged.
Um,
Pity.
Dang it. I'll be right back. I gotta use the bathroom. Wee. Dang it. I forgot my water. Where are we?
But there you go. It would have been interesting to see what it does. Interesting wasn't quite the word I would have used, needless to say. The other tech priest nodded in agreement. I dare say we could rig something up. Possibly a fusion bottle. He seemed to remember my presence all of a sudden and subsided, glaring at me again. Are you sure that's wise? I asked. Everyone looked at me, and I shrugged, determined not to seem too concerned at their evident hostility. I'm no expert, but... Quite right. You're not, Stadler snapped. So kindly leave theological matters to those who are. Fine. I tried to look as reasonable as I could. But might I suggest you at least delay the attempt until the Astartes arrive? And I was a long way away from any potential danger, of course. That should at least minimize any risk to the security of the expedition. The expedition is perfectly secure. Tarkus cut in, his voice tight, and I cursed myself for wounding his pride all over again. I see no reason to delay the furtherance of the Omnissiah's work. At that point, it all became academic anyway. Killian muttered something under his breath, and a faint click came from somewhere in the bowels of the machine. Ah, he said. That looks like a power coupling. Without any warning at all, a thin metal probe shot from the depths of the arachnoid automaton and buried itself in one of the hovering cyberskulls. A blue arc of energy sparked between them, and the servitor fell lifeless to the ground, bouncing off into a corner somewhere. Remarkable, Killian said again, and stepped forward for a closer look. I did exactly the opposite, you can be sure, retreating just far enough to ensure that Tarkus and his troopers stood between me and the sinister device. Stay back, I warned, drawing my last pistol. Tarkus seemed to remember my reputation at that point, and, clearly reasoning that if I was concerned he ought to be too, began to follow suit. The trooper raised his hellgun again. Put those down, Killian was outraged. Have you any idea of the importance of this artifact? Tarkus and the trooper began to obey, although I wasn't about to holster my weapon under any circumstances. Before we could debate the point, however,
Nicely
a loud
melee.
crack echoed through the cavern. The spider thing had teleported away, leaving air to rush into the void it had occupied like a miniature thunderclap. We stared at one another in mutual incomprehension for a moment. Where'd it go? The trooper asked, an expression of bafflement on his face which was almost comic. I shook my head. Emperor alone knows, I said. It must be somewhere nearby, Killian said. How far do these tunnels extend?
Good
Stadler
night.
shrugged.
Have a good night.
Kilometers. We've barely begun to map them. Killian began to look as though his new soldiers had been trodden on by an adult before he got the chance to play with them. We'll establish a search pattern, he said. We're bound to find it eventually. If it doesn't find you first, I added, before I could prevent the words from slipping out. Tarkus, to his credit, took my meaning at once. You think it's a guardian of some kind? I don't know, I admitted, but it's a reasonable guess. Whatever it's for, it was built to last. I'll double the sentries around the base camp, Tarkus said, but I already had an uncomfortable feeling that wasn't going to be enough. My first instinct, I might as well admit it, was to find some excuse to get back on the shuttle and return to the safety of the orbiting starship. This wasn't as easy as it sounds, though, despite the fact that I was clearly unwelcome so far as the majority of the tech priests were concerned, and Tarkus remained as prickly as ever. He was sensible enough to realize that someone who'd survived as many clashes with the enemy as I had was someone whose advice he should listen to. So, despite my impatience, I spent most of the day reviewing his plans for the defense of the camp, which were pretty sound, I'm bound to admit, although I was able to plug a couple of holes that would only have been obvious to someone
Oh,
with field experience.
okay.
And
Take
it
care
was
of the
several
pup.
hours before I had the chance to contact the Omnissiah's blessing and let them know I was on my way back. I just finished talking to the officer of the watch, whose image was floating in the hololith display, when his expression changed. "Just a moment, Commissar." He turned to confer with someone out of the hololith's field of vision. When he turned back, his expression was one of mild surprise. "We're picking up a discharge of warp energy. It looks like the Astartes are here already." That was the best news I'd heard since boarding the freighter. I had no doubt they'd make short work of the metal spider and anything else that might be lurking down there with us. "Good," I said. "If you can arrange to transfer my kit, I'll report aboard the barge directly from here. No point in taking any chances after all, and I'd certainly be safer scrounging a ride in a Thunderhawk than an unarmed shuttle." The officer just had time to look mildly surprised before his expression turned to one of alarm. "Unknown contact, closing fast. They're making an attack run." "Download your sensor data," Killian ordered at my elbow. Someone on the bridge must have complied, because the image in the hololith changed suddenly, showing us the pin-sharp starfield you only ever see from above an atmosphere. Something was moving across it, a crescent of darkness visible against the blackness of space only because of the flickering of the stars it briefly occulted. "What the hell?" I began, then found myself stunned into silence. A burst of light blazed from somewhere within that sinister silhouette, branching and spreading as it came, until an instant later it enveloped our point of view. The hololith went blank. "They've gone." Stadler was standing at a nearby lectern, his face lined with shock. "They can't be," I said, already feeling the truth of his words in the pit of my stomach. Killian nodded in confirmation. "I'm afraid he's right. All we're picking up is a cloud of debris." "Then we're just going to have to sit tight," I said, fighting to keep my voice calm. "The Astartes ship will be here soon, and it ought to be more than a match for these raiders." I wished I was as confident as I sounded. So long as nobody panics, we'll be fine. But of course, we weren't. The first attack came an hour or so later, while I was talking to Tarkus about the possibility of barricading the tunnel mouth we'd found. It would only have been a token gesture, of course, but one of the first things they teach you at the Schola is that anything you can do to make the troops feel that they're taking the initiative is good for morale. And needless to say, after the casual destruction of our ship, morale was pretty low. We'd been reviewing the available supplies, hoping to find something we could use, when Targus broke off in mid-conversation. "Can you hear that?" he asked. I nodded. A faint scuttling sound had been tickling my eardrums for the last few moments, but until he mentioned it, my subconscious had been editing it out.
All right, cool. Enjoy the
It was a
Discord.
sound I was so familiar with, I could identify it without thinking. "It's just vermin," I said. In my extensive experience of underground passageways, it had been a constant background noise. Then I remembered how desolate this world was, and that we'd seen no sign of life since we'd got here. I drew my las pistol slowly. Tarkus followed suit, picking up a nearby luminator with his other hand and pointing it into the surrounding darkness. My first impression was that the floor was moving, the beam shining back from a rippling surface which reminded me of sunlight on ocean waves, and then with a cry of revulsion, I began shooting. The metallic carpet which surged towards us was composed of miniature duplicates of the spider machine, thousands of them, and the lasbolts detonated in the middle of the swarm with about as much effect as if I'd been throwing stones. True, every shot was rewarded with a satisfying impact and a spray of metal, but there were so many that even with Tarkus's help I couldn't even hope to slow them down. "First squad to me," the lieutenant ordered, and within seconds we'd been joined by half a score of his redshirts, who directed a withering volley of hellgun fire at the scuttling swarm. They began to break, to my momentary relief, but only to part like the tide around a rock before rushing on towards the main bulk of the camp. They hit it like a tsunami, swarming over the precious equipment and ripping it to pieces with their metallic mandibles. Guards and tech priests alike scattered in panic, but many were too slow, being pulled down and engulfed by that hideous carpet of scuttling death. Within seconds, a few muffled screams quickly silenced, with the only traces of their presence left. "Pull back!" I ordered, taking command by reflex, as I'd been trained to do. A few scattered survivors regrouped around us, Killian and Stadler among them. The cadaverous tech priest's eyes were wide as he watched the swarm of automata demolishing the camp.
"Merciful Omnissiah," he gasped. "What are those things?"
"Beats me," I said. "I'm not qualified to comment on theological matters." It was a cheap shot, and I suppose I ought to be ashamed of myself, but I must admit to taking some quiet satisfaction in his venomous expression. I began edging the ragged group back towards the wall, hoping that with our backs to it, at least the machines couldn't get behind us. "Good thinking," Tarkus agreed, fanning his remaining subordinates out to form a skirmishing screen between us and the scuttling horrors. Stadler reached that obsidian surface first and pressed his back against it as though hoping he could squeeze an extra couple of millimeters of space out of the cavern. All at once his expression changed to one of astonishment, blood and lubricants fountaining from his augmented body as something invisible slashed him to pieces from behind. I whirled, seeking a target, and suddenly saw it looming over his shattered corpse. A ghastly skeletal visage hovered in the air on gently humming grav units, the razor-edged blades of its fingers stained crimson, its torso ending in a long curved tail which looked like vertebrae. To add to the horror, the apparition was constructed of the same gleaming metal as the spider and its miniature offspring. "It came through the wall!" One of the troopers was gibbering in shock, his face white, at least the parts of it which were still composed of flesh. "It came through the wall!" He raised the Hellgun and ripped off a burst on full auto. The entity drifted forwards unhurriedly, the flurry of lasbolts detonating against the wall behind it, defacing the enigmatic symbols etched there. With a deepening sense of horror, I realized that the volley had been on target, but the lasbolts had simply passed through the apparition, whatever it was. The trooper was still firing, his finger clamped on the trigger in a rictus of panic as the drifting horror reached out casually and tore his face off. The man's screams were abruptly terminated as the thing's tail lashed up to transfix him. His spasming corpse hung there for a moment before dropping to the floor again. The group disintegrated immediately, troopers and tech priests alike fleeing in panic whichever way their feet took them. I laid a restraining hand on Killian's arm as the metallic ghoul accelerated after them, casually slapping down a couple of victims as it passed. "Stay put," I snapped. "These things are trying to panic you." The strategy was obvious. Split everyone up and hunt us down one by one. If we stayed together, we could watch one another's
it
backs
takes forever for
and
this
greatly
thing.
increase our chances of survival. Tarkus had clearly realized this too. "Regroup!" he was bellowing, despite the obvious disinclination of any of his men to follow orders. Hellguns spat almost at random, a few of the lasbolts actually managing to hit the hovering ghoul as it solidified for long enough to eviscerate another unfortunate cogboy, but the vast majority of shots passed through it or missed altogether. "Reform at once, you sons of—" His voice broke off abruptly, rising to a suddenly terminated scream as a bolt of vivid green light enveloped him. For a moment I could see a bloody mess of internal organs as he seemed to fade away from the outside in, dwindling like candle wax, and then he was gone, as though he'd never existed. Emperor on Earth. I turned to see what fresh horrors this place had disgorged, and a sudden rush of terror hit me in the gut. Thin, skeletal automata were advancing across the cavern, casually blasting everything that still lived with those hideous beams. Wherever those messengers of death walked, people died, dwindled to nothing by their hellish guns or sliced apart by the combat blades attached to the barrels. To give them their due, the tech guards gave a good account of themselves in the main, their hellguns felling 2 or 3 of their assailants, but it seemed to take a lot of fire to down one. I even saw one with its chest blown open stir and rise to its feet again, the eldritch metal of which it was composed flowing like liquid to heal its wounds. "Frack this," I said, dragging the Magos towards the mouth of the tunnel. If we stayed where we were, we'd be killed with the others. But there was a remote chance that we might find some kind of refuge if we slipped away while these ghastly automata were slaughtering our companions. All we had to do, I kept telling myself, was hold on until the Astartes arrived. How we'd know they were here or let them know we'd survived was a problem for later, which I resolutely refused to consider right now. To my astonishment, we made it to the tunnels without further mishap, and I hurried Killian along as rapidly as I could, the sounds of carnage diminishing in our ears. The slick black stone seemed to absorb sound as well as light, silence descending around us like a shroud. My old hive boy's senses were sufficiently acute for me to be able to tell from the subtle change in the echoes around us when we passed the openings of cross corridors, but on several occasions I was grateful for my companion's apparent ability to see in the dark. At least the metallic warriors were easy to evade, their hellish weapons giving off an eerie green glow which forewarned us of their presence in plenty of time to dive for cover. It was after we'd been wandering for some time that I noticed the darkness around me was beginning to attenuate, a diffuse green refulgence becoming visible from up ahead. At first I thought it was merely another patrol, but after lurking cautiously for a moment and finding that it remained unchanged in its intensity, we pressed on. Killian was curious to discover the source, still hoping to bag a piece of archaeotech probably, and if I was going to have to fight again, I preferred to do it where I could see what was trying to kill me. As the glow grew brighter, I began to hear something too, a faint buzzing sound which resonated in my skull and set my teeth on edge. The palms of my hands began to tingle as we reached a chamber bathed in that sick green glow, and a faint sense of nausea rose within me. Killian, on the other hand, seemed enraptured. The cavern was vast, even larger if that was possible than the one we'd first discovered, but rather than being empty, was stuffed with strange devices beyond my ability to comprehend. Most were emitting that strange necrotic light, however, and I began to apprehend that it was somehow connected to their power source. Fascinating. The tech priest wandered into the center of the room, his eyes darting everywhere, trying to take in every detail of his surroundings. Mine, on the other hand, were concerned only with making sure we were alone. At least we appeared to be safe in that assumption. Abruptly, the light flared, and a sudden thundercrack of displaced air echoed across that unholy room. A dozen of the skeletal warriors were suddenly standing on a raised dais before a curtain of rippling green light and turning their expressionless heads towards us. "A warp portal!" Killian seemed transfixed. "We've known it's a theoretical possibility, of course, but—" "Fight now, talk later!" I screamed, certain we were staring death in the face and determined to defy it for as long as possible. As I unleashed a flurry of lasbolts at the nearest figure, I could see that its torso was already damaged, a couple of holes punched through it by what looked like armor-piercing rounds. I hadn't noticed any bolters among the tech guard's armory, but I was glad of somebody's foresight as one of my rounds entered the gap and blew the automaton apart from the inside. The others all lifted their greenly glowing weapons as one and aimed them at me.
I think my
For
little
an instant, the conviction
guy
of my
froze.
own imminent death left me paralyzed. "Get down!" Killian cannoned into me the instant they fired, knocking me to one side and taking the full force of the barrage himself.
Right. So
He flashed into vapor in an instant, leaving me rolling
There we
across
go.
the floor towards those murderous statues. I raised my right hand to aim the las pistol and found it was gone, along with two of my fingers, but there was no time to worry about that now. My survival instinct had kicked in like never before, and I lunged desperately past the dreadful automata, a direction they never expected me to take, diving headfirst into the curtain of energy behind them. You might be wondering how anyone could be so foolish, but consider. Remaining where I was would be certain death. There was absolutely no doubt about that. Whereas taking my chances with the portal meant death was only virtually assured. And it was that narrow difference which preserved me for long enough to record this account. The actual passage was a timeless instant. One moment I was in the
that
chamber
helped a
below
lot,
the bowels
apparently.
of Interitus Prime. The next, I found myself surrounded by the noise of combat. The light, wherever I was the same bilious hue, but the chamber I was now in was far smaller. And, as I was subsequently to discover, my immediate guess that I was aboard the starship which had attacked our freighter was an accurate one. Staccato explosions echoed from the sloping walls surrounding me, and I rolled to my feet, dazed, as another of the metal warriors came at me. I tried to draw my chainsword, but
All
stumbled,
right, so
weak
it's
from
going
the
to
loss
take a
of
while
blood,
to
and would
process.
surely have fallen had not a vast forearm encased in ceramite swung out of nowhere to bear me up. A storm bolter barked about a meter away, deafening me for a moment and tearing the gleaming assassin to shreds.
Brother Captain, I've found a survivor.
A voice, louder than I'd previously heard, boomed, and I turned to find myself in the grasp of a giant encased in a suit of Terminator armor.
Bring him.
A second giant said, looming into view from behind another of the incomprehensible alien devices.
The demolition charges are set.
Despite everything, I found a smile beginning to force its way onto my face. I hadn't noticed any bolters among the tech guard's armory, but I was glad of somebody's foresight as one of my rounds entered the gap and blew the automaton apart from the inside. The others all lifted their greenly glowing weapons as one and aimed them at me. For an instant, the conviction of my own imminent death left me paralyzed. "Get down!" Killian cannoned into me the instant they fired, knocking me to one side and taking the full force of the barrage himself. He flashed into vapor in an instant, leaving me
11
rolling
hours.
across the floor towards those murderous statues.
Okay.
I raised my right hand to aim the las pistol and found it was gone, along with two of my fingers, but there was no time to worry about that now. My survival instinct had kicked in like never before, and I lunged desperately past the dreadful automata, a direction they never expected me to take, diving headfirst into the curtain of energy behind them. You might be wondering how anyone could be so foolish, but consider. Remaining where I was would be certain death. There was absolutely no doubt about that. Whereas taking my chances with the portal meant death was only virtually assured. And it was that narrow difference which preserved me for long enough to record this account. The actual passage was a timeless instant. One moment I was in the chamber below the bowels of Interitus Prime. The next, I found myself surrounded by the noise of combat. The light, wherever I was the same bilious hue, but the chamber I was now in was far smaller. And, as I was subsequently to discover, my immediate guess that I was aboard the starship which had attacked our freighter was an accurate one. Staccato explosions echoed from the sloping walls surrounding me, and I rolled to my feet, dazed, as another of the metal warriors came at me. I tried to draw my chainsword, but stumbled, weak from the loss of blood, and would surely have fallen had not a vast forearm encased in ceramite swung out of nowhere to bear me up. A storm bolter barked about a meter away, deafening me for a moment and tearing the gleaming assassin to shreds.
Brother Captain, I've found a survivor.
A voice, louder than I'd previously heard, boomed, and I turned to find myself in the grasp of a giant encased in a suit of Terminator armor.
Bring him.
A second giant said, looming into view from behind another of the incomprehensible alien devices.
The demolition charges are set.
Despite everything, I found a smile beginning to force its way onto my face.
Alright, checking on the print. Checking on the print. Sad mess up. I gotta go check that. I'll be right back. Alright, I'll be right back. Alright. So, it wasn't a messed up print, it was just supports. G-code. Yay, let's see what's wrong. See, the supports for some reason will go off the build plate. Gotta go find that. Gotta go edit that. Let's see. Will doing it like this help at all? And if I do it like that, it won't fit. Okay. It just means I'm going to add one build plate, put one here, put one here. They'll just get their own build plates. See if this slice it. $8. Yeah, that sounds about right. Actually, huh. I wonder if that works there. Can I just put this here and put this like right here? See if that will do anything. If it doesn't, I'll just hit the backspace button. Do 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 do. Yeah, it's an inconvenience. Also, the Helldivers robot guy that you printed, I didn't realize. I thought it was a space orc. Honestly, I thought it was like a black, one of the orcs from um, Warhammer 40k. Do 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 do. All right, here's a little trick I learned. I can make it go faster if I turn this up to 240. Enter. This should climb. There we go. And speed, I can turn it into sport. And press enter. I think it's 120%. And it will turn down the time from what was this, 17 hours to, it should like show in a minute. No, that's the whole point of the bamboo printer, is that it's supposed to be able to go at ludicrous speeds. You may just have to change out the hot end, because if you run it at this speeds for a long time, or you might need to clean the belts and replace them because they're wear items. But hey, I just took off 3 hours off the print. Yeah, and I should be up in like 9 hours, so that should be fine. Alright, so yeah, I'm gonna have to do, look at this. Let's see. I wish it would let me move. If I move this one closer. Now, will it work? While it does that, let's check out, I guess, just watch the print. I don't want to keep going to the audiobook because if I do that, it will. I don't think I think it's like 45 minutes to an hour long chapter, and I don't want to continue. Yeah, it's
Sector
an hour.
13. Of all the worlds I've visited in
So, all right, let's see what's wrong now. Ugh. What about now?
Sector 13. Of all the worlds I've visited in my long and discreditable career, I suppose Kefir stands out as one of the most pleasant. In the abstract, at least, we were there to fight a war, don't forget.
All
So
the pieces are
there was
big.
plenty to keep the mind occupied, but in the main, I look back on my years there through a faint haze of nostalgia. Being an agri-world, the landscape was almost completely rural, so my overriding impression was one of endless plains of lush greenery
Nice.
cut across by isolated roads, which occasionally intersected at quaint rustic villages where nothing much seemed to have changed since the Emperor was in short trousers. The climate was pleasant too. The small ice caps trickling clear fresh water into all three continents from large polar mountain ranges, while the narrow equatorial band was mercifully free of any landmass worth fighting over. There were a few small island chains where tiny inbred communities fished and grew tropical fruit, but they were too insignificant to have attracted any enemy attention and were ignored by our side too after the initial sweeps. All in all, I was pretty pleased with life. My inadvertent heroism on Desolatia a couple of years before had won me a little notoriety among the Imperial Task Force, and I'd been able to capitalize on that quite nicely. Even after all this time, there were still sufficient senior officers and administratum functionaries wanting to shake my hand to keep me comfortably occupied, attending receptions and seminars far from the fighting, so that I frequently found myself away from my unit for days on end. A deprivation that Colonel Mostru, our commanding officer, bore with commendable fortitude, I have to say. Even while I was at my post, things were hardly onerous. The 12th Valhallan Field Artillery were parked well behind the lines, as you'd expect, so I'd had little occasion to face the enemy directly. Indeed, since we were engaged in a protracted campaign to cleanse the planet of a gene-stealer infestation, there was seldom anything to fire our guns at in any case. The war was a subtle one for the most part, a counterinsurgency and surgical strikes, with the enemy seldom massing in numbers sufficient to justify an artillery barrage. The occasional exceptions to this were renegade units of the local planetary defense force, which would turn out to be riddled with Steeler cultists with depressing regularity, and turn their guns on the guard or the local units sent to deal with them until our overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower had their inevitable effect. Like most agri-worlds, Kefir was sparsely populated by Imperial standards. This made our job of cleansing the place both easier and harder than it might have been. Easier, in that
16
cities were
hours.
few and far between. I think there were no more than a dozen on the entire globe, which meant that the dense concentrations of population Steeler cult needs to really take root and hide in were absent, but harder in that the cult had instead become attenuated, spreading its tentacles widely in small pockets of infestation rather than remaining sufficiently concentrated to root out and destroy in a single strike. The upshot of all this was that we'd been forced into a protracted campaign, cleansing the world province by province, one brood at a time, and we'd already seen 3 winters come and go since we'd arrived here. Some, of course, found the slow pace of the campaign frustrating, not least my crony and closest friend in the battery, Lieutenant Davis, who, as always, was chafing at the bit, eager to get the matter over with and move on to the next war. "We're making progress," I told him, uncorking the bottle of well-matured Amasec, which had somehow found its way into my kit bag after the last round of handshaking and finger food I'd been dragged off to. "Both the northern continents are completely clean already."
Nice.
"But they were only ever lightly infested to begin with," he rejoined, finding a couple of tea bowls in the clutter on my desk, which Jurgen, my aide, had failed to tidy up before disappearing on some mysterious errand of his own. "The majority of the Steelers were always down south of here. You know that." "Your point being?" I asked, pouring the amber liquid with care. Davis shrugged, looking uncannily like a bored child getting tired of the current amusement. "I don't know. We could be here for years yet if something doesn't change." "I suppose we could," I agreed, trying not to sound too pleased at the prospect. "That would have suited me fine. My adventures with the Tyranids on Desolatia striking me as more than enough excitement for one commissarial career. Had I but known, of course, it had just been the prelude to a lifetime of narrow escapes from almost certain death. But back then, I had yet to develop the innate paranoia which was to serve me so well in my subsequent century of running for cover and shooting back when I couldn't avoid it. The prolonged period of relative quiet had lulled me into a false sense of security, which a few years later would have elicited nothing more than a vague sense of waiting for the other boot to drop. So as I poured the drinks, I had little inkling of the fact that the turning point of the entire campaign was no more than a few hours away, and that once again I would find myself caught up in the middle of events over which I had not the slightest control. The irony was that I'd had my chance to avoid it, but at the time I thought I was being remarkably prudent in not doing so. You see, Colonel Mostrew had never quite shaken the feeling that I'd been less than honest about my supposed heroism on Desolatia, when my attempt to save my own neck had inadvertently stumbled across a swarm of nids which would otherwise have annihilated us, and my subsequent panicked dash back to our own lines had drawn them neatly into the killing zone of our guns. He'd never said anything directly about it, of course, but after that he made a point of creating subtle opportunities for me to prove my mettle, which generally amounted to nudging me in the general direction of trouble and looking out for any overt sign of reluctance to put myself in harm's way again. Luckily, my side trips away from the battery had limited his opportunities for such amusements, but on a couple of occasions I'd been left with no alternative but to tag along with a forward observer unit with every outward show of enthusiasm, so as not to undermine my fraudulent reputation. As it turned out, these little expeditions hadn't been nearly as unpleasant as I'd anticipated. On each occasion, we'd taken some fire from the cultists as soon as they realized we were sitting out ahead of our own lines, calling in their positions to the battery, but to my well-disguised relief, the subsequent barrages had taken care of that before they got close or accurate enough to be a real nuisance. To all intents and purposes, they'd remained a distant threat, despite the occasional lasbolt putting a dent in the sandbags protecting us. Indeed, in all these minor engagements, I'd never even seen the enemy close enough to tell whether they were true hybrids or merely their human dupes. All that was about to change, though, when the Colonel stuck his head into my office the morning after my chat with Davis. "Commissar," he said, nailing me with those ice-blue eyes which always seemed to see a lot further into me than I was comfortable with. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course," I responded, with every sign of politeness, ignoring the faint throbbing of the Amasec hangover I brought into the room with me that morning. "Can I offer you some tea?" "Thank you, no." He moved aside hastily as Jurgen began to pour an extra bowl. I no need refuse, of course, which is why I'd offered. My aide was a splendid fellow in many respects, not the least of which was a singular lack of imagination that he compensated for with a deference to authority, and a literal-minded approach to following orders which simplified my own life in many ways. But he was hardly the most prepossessing trooper in the guard, and apart from his habitual untidiness, his spectacular body odour meant that visitors were loath to linger in his general vicinity, certainly not for as long as it would take to drink a bowl of tanner leaf tea, one of the few Valhallan habits I've picked up from my prolonged association with the natives of that icebound world, by the way. It's made from a plant that grows in the caverns there, and it has a faintly bitter aftertaste I find most refreshing. As you wish. I sipped at the fragrant liquid and raised an eyebrow
Untitled
in
Goose
polite
game
inquiry.
keeps having issues for me.
How can I help you? There's a briefing about the deployment of the garrison troops this afternoon at brigade headquarters, Mostru said, clearly fighting the impulse to back away from Jurgen. Unlike the ice worlders I'd served with, I had my office and quarters open to the sweet spring breezes, instead of air-conditioned to the temperature of a meat locker, and he clearly found the relative warmth mildly uncomfortable, not least because it let my age distinctive bouquet flourish. Another good reason for leaving the windows open, of course. I thought you might like to attend, and get palmed off on some risky reconnaissance mission to the battlefront as soon as we were there, no doubt. But I couldn't simply refuse. Inviting me to observe the peacekeeping arrangements for the newly cleansed continents on behalf of the Commissariat was a courtesy, at least on the surface.
Come
so
on.
I thought I'd better just accept, go along, and hope I could find some excuse to hang back when the danger presented itself. I was just opening my mouth to agree, inwardly cursing the colonel, when Jurgen unexpectedly came to my rescue. Begging your pardon, sir, but if you're going to be leaving the battery, you'd better reply to the custodies first. The custodies? Mostru's eyebrow rose in slightly exaggerated surprise. Have you been up to something I should be concerned about? Quite a bit, as it happened, but I wasn't about to tell him that. Instead, I picked up the data slate with the flashing red urgent icon Jurgen had placed on my desk, and which I hadn't been able to face looking at through the hangover until the tanner tea kicked in, and glanced at it briefly.
Come on.
Not this time. I smiled too, so we could both pretend it was a joke, and nodded to Jurgen. Thank you for reminding me. I turned back to the colonel. A few of our gunners are in civilian custody. It seems they got a little over-exuberant in one of the local hostelries last night. I sighed, with carefully feigned regret. So, pleasant as this little trip of yours sounds, I suppose I'll have to stay here and sort things out. Of course. He nodded soberly, always a sucker for the duty-first routine, and for once I didn't have to stretch it. Discipline in the battery was definitely my responsibility, so I had the perfect excuse for sidestepping whatever little inconvenience he'd been planning to drop on me. Of course, if I'd known what sorting out that apparently trivial little piece of paperwork would lead to, I'd have gone with him like a shot and taken my chances, but
Still.
I never cemented my reputation as a bona fide hero, and the war for Kefir would have taken another turn entirely. The nearest village to our artillery park, Pagus Parva, was about 20 minutes away, or 10 the way Jurgen drove, so I had little time to enjoy the fresh spring air as it wafted in across the kilometres of open fields that lined the road. I'd become quite familiar with the place in the past few months, so I was already well aware that it was somewhat larger than its name implied. It was the bureaucratic centre of the region, Sector 13 on the maps of the continent we've been supplied with by the local administratum, so boasted a handful of civic buildings as solid and imposing as the temples and libraries of far larger settlements. In peacetime, it had been home to some 2,000 souls, rather than a handful of hundreds in the surrounding villages, most of them engaged in supporting the scattered farmsteads which clustered around it in some way. But the upheaval of war and the arrival of so many guardsmen in the area with pay packets in need of emptying had almost doubled the population. It goes without saying that most of the new arrivals were supporting the war effort by maintaining morale among the troopers in ways which didn't entirely meet the approval of the long-term residents, or for that matter the local custodies, which had tripled its manpower over the last few months. That had sounded pretty impressive, until I'd realized all it meant was that the sector sergeant had been joined by a couple of resentful beat-pounders from the provincial capital, who had clearly been selected on the basis of whoever the authorities there had felt the city was most able to manage perfectly well without. The sergeant herself was another matter entirely, as I knew quite well, having taken care to establish good relations with the local custodies as soon as we were deployed in the region. And to my pleasant surprise, this had developed into rather more than a simple working relationship. Winifred Pooh was a solid career officer in her mid-30s, about a decade older than I was at the time, with a full figure which looked quite good in uniform, and even better out of it, as I discovered on a couple of occasions. She was good at her job, knew most of the locals by sight, if not by name and reputation, and turned down the chance of more challenging duties in the city at least 3 times that I knew of, because she enjoyed the sense of being part of a close-knit rural community. Despite our friendship, she eyed me coolly as I entered the custodies post from which she exercised her stewardship of the scattered hamlets and villages of Sector 13. "You took your time," she said. I shrugged, smiling cordially for the benefit of her subordinates, who were slouching around the place trying to look busy and advancing the colonnaded entrance hall of the sector house towards the high wooden counter, which barred the public from the working part of the building. I know,
Why is
my
there soap?
apologies. I adopted an expression of resigned good humor. They keep us pretty busy in the guard, you know. I can imagine. If the ones we've got downstairs are anything to go by. She prodded the room, which retracted part of the counter, having recognized her thumbprint, and recoiled slightly as Jurgen followed me through the gap. The nearest constable's jaw dropped visibly as the gap closed behind us with a faint squeak of unoiled runners. "Who's this?" "My aide, Gunner Jurgen." I performed the traditional back-and-forth hand gesture, which has accompanied informal introductions since time immemorial. "Jurgen, Sergeant Pooh of the Custodies." "Nice to
Jesus.
meet you, miss." He threw her a sloppy salute, which wasn't strictly necessary, what with her being a custodian and all, but to Jurgen, a sergeant was a sergeant, and that was that. Besides, she appreciated the courtesy and reciprocated with a nod. "Likewise." The pleasantry was reflexive, but Jurgen smiled broadly anyway, curdling the expression of the constable even more, if that were possible. Winifred appeared to notice him for the first time. "Larrabee, go and collect the commissar's men and sort out the charge sheets." "Ma'am." He acknowledged her order with a manifest lack of enthusiasm that would have got any trooper in the guard a stiff talking to at the very least, and slouched off in the direction of the cells. "You'd better go with him," I told Jurgen. "Make sure they behave themselves." "Sir?" He trotted off behind the constable, who seemed to move a little faster as his new companion approached, leaving me alone with Winifred. I'd been hoping for a little friendly conversation, even a mild flirtation or two, but her mind was entirely on business that morning, and I had to make do with a smile and the offer of a mug of recaf. "Let me guess," I said as I scanned the data slates and let them read
Stealth.
my thumbprint to confirm that I'd taken charge of the recidivists in the name of the commissariat. "Drunk and disorderly, lewd conduct, and a couple of brawls." Winifred's mouth quirked with what looked like genuine amusement. "You obviously know your men well," she said dryly. She sipped her mug of recaf. "I know these ones a bit too well," I said, scanning the 5 names, which between them made up a good 10% of my workload. That might not sound much to you, but in a battery of over 300 guardsmen, it was a pretty impressive achievement in its own way. "Hoken, Nordstrom, Milson, Jarvik." And I raised my head to stare disapprovingly at the leading trooper as the small knot of men emerged sheepishly from the cells. And the inevitable Gunner Elson. He grinned at me with the abashed expression I'd become all too familiar with over the last couple of years. "Tell me, Elson, are you planning to make latrine orderly a full-time career?" He shrugged. "We serve the Emperor as our talents direct," he quoted, listening to sniggers from among his compatriots. "Where you're concerned, he delegates to me," I riposted. The custodians looked a little surprised at the informality of the exchange, but I felt no obligation to enlighten them. Elson had saved my life back on Desolation, picking off a tyrannid gargoyle which was swooping on me from behind, and was under the fond illusion that I cut him a little more slack as a result. In actual fact, he was completely mistaken about this, but I did nothing to disabuse him or anyone else of the notion, being keenly aware that if the rest of the troopers believed that looking out for the Commissar's welfare would rebound to their own advantage, I stood a much better chance of enjoying a long and successful career. I swept an evaluating eye over the little knot of troopers. All right, Nordstrom, who started it? Of all of them, Nordstrom was visibly by far the worst aware. The others might have been hungover still, but were at least able to function. Jarvik and Håkan had to hold him up between them, and he seemed to focus on the sound of my voice with a visible effort. I'm not sure, sir. He managed to slur after a moment. Star what? Milson and Erlson exchanged glances and sniggered. If anyone had more clearly been in a brawl, I had yet to meet them. Nordstrom's knuckles were bruised and bloodied, his face showing visible contusions, and as his torn, unfastened shirt swung open, I caught sight of a dressing patch at the bottom of his ribcage. Is that a knife wound? I asked, unable to get a sudden flare of concern from my voice. If it was, the ensuing paperwork would take up the rest of the day, but Winitha shook her head. No, it's superficial. It was hardly even bleeding when we found him. And where was that? I asked. She shrugged. An alley off Harvest Street. No surprise there. It was right in the middle of the area most of the newer residents plied their trade in. A couple of square blocks of taverns, gambling dens and bordellos, which had sprung up like mushrooms in the shadow of the Agricultural Records Office, to the great discomfiture of the administratum adepts who worked there. At least so they said. It was those crux fondlers in the Crescent Moon, Jarvik said. I bet you. The others nodded, muttering dangerously. They put something in your drink and rob you blind when you keel over. It sounded like nothing more than gossip to me, but Milson was nodding eagerly in agreement. It's true. They did the same thing to me a couple of weeks back. I glanced at Winitha, who shrugged. Wouldn't surprise me if he did get rolled, she said. We're always scraping drunken guardsmen off the streets around there, and they've usually been picked clean by the time we get to them. I wasn't drunk, Wilson asserted vehemently. Well, not very. Not that much, anyway. Well, I know how to hold me ale. That much, at least, I knew to be true. Most of the entries in the voluminous file I had on him were for minor infractions involving civic property and small items he'd found lying around somewhere, rather than excessive intoxication. I returned my attention to Nordstrom. Nordstrom, I said slowly, trying to get him to concentrate. What's the last thing you remember? His brow furrowed. Go and fight. That much was obvious. And judging by the condition he was in, I'd be surprised if he remembered any of the details. But Winitha pounced on the opening. Who with? Once again, Nordstrom's face contorted with the effort of thinking. So, he said at last. Thawin? How about before that? I suggested. This all seemed like a waste of time to me, but I suppose Winitha had to at least make an effort to investigate what went on a few hundred meters from us. The longer I lingered, the more I could appreciate her company, and the more time there was for Mostru to leave for brigade headquarters without dragging me along to whatever little surprise he had planned. There was a girl, wasn't there? Wilson interrupted. With purple hair. I glared at him to try and shut him up, but Nordstrom was nodding. The ghost of a smile appeared on his face. For a moment, a similar dreamy expression descended on Milson too. Amazing tattoos. I knew it. Milson looked triumphant. The last thing I remember before coming round in the alley is buying her a drink. Ring any bells? I asked Winitha, who was also nodding, but with purposeful recognition. Sounds like one of the local Joy girls. Works out of the Crescent Moon. There, that proves it, Jarvik said. He glanced meaningfully at his friends. Someone should go around there and sort them out. It was pretty clear from the tone of his voice who he had in mind for the job. I had no objection to that in principle, having having found other establishments more congenial for my own recreational purposes, but this was edging into the realm of things I didn't want to know about because they'd make my job more complicated if I did. So I cut in quickly before they said anything which sounded like a positive plan of action. After all, if I didn't know about any potential trouble, I could hardly be expected to head it off, could I? I think we can safely leave that in the hands of the custodians, I said with all the authority I could muster. To his credit, Yarvik took the hint and shut up, although I would have laid a small wager that the next time I came to town, I'd find the Crescent Moon's windows boarded up at the very least. Worth shaking the tree, I suppose, Winifred said to my vague surprise. She looked at the constable she'd addressed before. Larrabee, keep an eye on things while I'm gone. She gestured to her other colleague, whose name I never caught, with a brusque jerk of her head. You're with me. After a pace or two, she paused and smiled at me. Commissar, it was one of your men who made the complaint after all. I was a little taken aback, I don't mind admitting. And had I realized what I was letting myself in for, I would have loaded my collection of defaulters aboard the truck outside and headed back to the battery as fast as I could, and taken my chances with Mostru. But it seemed like a harmless enough way of wasting a couple of hours on a pleasant spring morning, and there was always the possibility of a little time alone with Winifred, so I found myself nodding in agreement. Good idea, Sergeant. It'll save us having to bounce reports and data files off each other for the rest of the week. I glanced disapprovingly at the little group of disheveled gunners, and give Nordstrom a chance to pull himself together before we leave. I could see from the covert glances that the troopers exchanged I'd done the right thing there, reinforcing my carefully constructed facade of being firm but fair.
Why do they have
Then
different
I
gate
strolled
holes
out of the
but
building
no?
to join Winifred, savoring the sweet spring sunshine for the last time that day. The Crescent Moon was a seedy-looking establishment at the best of times, which was after dark with the flare of pink and blue luminators flashing to lure the indiscriminating customer inside. In daylight, it looked even worse. The peeling paint on the shutters and crumbling plascrete of the facade was a foretaste of the cheap wooden furnishings and even cheaper liquor on sale inside. There were some suspicious-looking stains on the pavement next to the waste bins that I took pains to give a wide berth to as Winifred hammered on the door with the butt of her las pistol. "Custodians, open up!" she yelled, with surprising volume for a woman
How do I
so
make him go
small.
barefoot?
After a few seconds of nothing, she repeated the procedure, attracting the attention of a small gaggle of passing administratum drones that glanced at us furtively and started muttering to each other that it was about time somebody did something about that dreadful place. The door remained resolutely shut. "Oh dear, there doesn't seem to be anyone in," Winifred said loudly, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. She turned to the constable, who had gripped his own side with an anticipatory glint in his eye. "We'll have to blow the hinges off." Someone had evidently been listening, because there was a sudden rattling of bolts, and the door creaked open
How do I do
slightly
that?
to reveal an unhealthy-looking individual in badly fitting clothes and a barman's apron, which might originally have been some kind of color under its patchwork of stains. "Oh wait, my mistake." "Yes," the man said, his hunched posture making his ingratiating tone sound even more insincere than it undoubtedly was. "How can I help you, officers?" His voice trailed off uncertainly as he caught sight of me for the first time. Whatever he'd been expecting, an Imperial Guard commissar certainly wasn't it. "Commissar Calvus Kane," I introduced myself, hoping that something of my reputation had preceded me, a pretty safe bet given the number of guardsmen among the clientele. A slight widening of his eyes suggested that it had indeed done so. Before I could capitalize on it, Winifred took charge again. "Kamala Dobrovelski, we want a quiet word." Winifred pushed on without ceremony. "She works here, right?" "Yes, she does." The barman scuttled after us, agitation oozing from every pore. "But the management is in no way responsible for any actions by members of staff which contravene—" "Shut it!" The new voice confused me for a moment, until I realized the constable had spoken. Until then, I vaguely assumed he was mute. "Just tell us where she is." "Upstairs." The barman's eyes were fixed on the las pistols in the hands of the two custodians. I glanced around, finding nothing that looked like a threat. The establishment was as shabby as I'd anticipated, looking more like a downhive drinking den than something you'd expect to find on an agri-world. But I guess their customers weren't paying for sophisticated decor. Thank you. Your cooperation has been noted, Winifred said dryly. We left the barman goggling after us and headed for the door in the back of the room with a crudely lettered sign stapled to it saying, "Staff only." Behind it, a corridor led to the back of the building, presumably to a storage area, and, judging by the smell, either a kitchen or a waste dump. In a place like that, it was hard to tell the difference, along with a rickety flight of stairs which ascended sharply to the left. "This must be it," I said. Winifred agreed and led the way up the stairs, which ran into a corridor running the length of the building, lined with simple wooden doors. The three of us looked at each other and shrugged. "One at a time?" I suggested. "Oh, no need." Winifred jerked a thumb at the door to a nearby room a few meters along from us. It had a small ceramic plate adhering to it, with a picture of a fat pink pony in a ballet dress, and Camilla's room written underneath in wobbly letters that were presumably supposed to look like they'd been done in crayon. This must be it. Before I could say anything humorous about her powers of deduction, she turned suddenly and kicked the thin wooden panel from its hinges. A feminine shriek of surprise and outrage confirmed that we'd found our quarry, and the constable and I followed the sergeant quickly through the wreckage of the door. "Kamala Dobrovelski?" she asked, although the question was only a formality. The girl sitting up in the rumpled bed matched Milson's description perfectly. Purple hair tumbling around a narrow face, twisted with shock
How do I
and
get
anger.
him out of the other chute?
"Get some clothes on. You're coming with us." "What for?" She began to comply with ill grace, revealing a body entwined with tattoos of a strange but compelling design, just as Nordstrom had said. Despite myself, I couldn't resist studying them, taking in how they accentuated the curves of her body, and as I did so, I felt the palms of my hands begin to tingle. Always a reliable warning to my subconscious that something isn't quite right. She looked up and glared at me. "Enjoying the view, Caiaphas?" "I didn't know you'd met," Winifred said, switching her attention to me, her tone the temperature of a Valhallan midwinter morning. "We haven't," I said. The faint narrowing of the Joy Girl's eyes as I spoke was enough to tell me that she realized the slip of the tongue had just given her away. And now that the subconscious hint I'd noticed before was hammering against my forebrain, it was obvious there was something not quite right about her musculature, which the tattoos were designed to obscure. But I did tell the barman my name. I began to draw my chainsword. "And stealers communicate telepath..." With an inhuman screech, Kamala sprang from the bed, faster than I would have believed possible, barging into the constable who was still blocking the doorway. He tried to bring up his sidearm, but was too close. Kamala's jaw elongated somehow, revealing a mouthful of razor-sharp fangs which clamped down on his throat, shearing through flesh and cartilage and decorating the shabby room with a bright spray of crimson. "Emperor on earth!" Winifred snapped off a shot, the lasbolt punching a hole through the shoddy partition wall next to its head as the shrieking hybrid turned from the spasming body of the constable back towards us. Beyond it, I could hear feet in the corridor outside. Even though I couldn't see the owners, the sound had a peculiar scuttling quality. The chainsaw cleared the scabbard, and I swung it desperately as Kamala leapt again. "It's a whole nest of them!" I parried a strike from a hand tipped with talon-like fingernails, feeling the blade bite through chitinous skin, and ducked as those murderous jaws snapped closed a handspan from my face. Winifred fired again, and for a moment I thought she'd missed, until I realized she was holding off the rest of the brood. Clearly, I'd have to finish this on my own. I swept the humming blade back in a counterstrike, taking the hybrid in the thorax and severing the spinal column. Foul-smelling ichor gushed, reminding me uncomfortably for a moment of the gaunts I'd faced on Desolatia, and the thing that had called itself Kamala dropped at my feet. "We're boxed in!" Winifred yelled. It certainly looked that way. The narrow cubicle was windowless, the only doorway crowded with horribly distorted parodies of humanity howling for our blood. She was placing her shots with care, picking off any foolish enough to show themselves directly with lasbolts to the head or chest, and pumping rounds through the thin wall from time to time to keep them from rushing the narrow space. I glanced around, a desperate plan beginning to form in my head. "Keep them off as long as you can," I yelled, swinging the humming blade at the thin wooden wall wall separating us from the adjoining cubicle. It bit hungrily, whining loudly as wood chips sprayed the room, and in seconds I'd carved a hole large enough to accommodate us. I jumped through it, holding my hammer weapon up, ready to block an attack from the other side of the wall as I emerged, but the room beyond turned out to be unoccupied. The Golden Throne be praised. Bright morning sunshine illuminated a shabby bedroom almost identical to the one we'd just left, through a window so grubby it might almost have been a... Nevertheless, it was the work of a moment to smash the glass with the pommel of the chainsword and dive through, heedless of the drop beyond, while Winifred sent a fusillade of parting shots through the gap behind us to delay our pursuers. I hit the pavement hard, heedless of the jolt that drove the breath from my lungs, relaxing to absorb the impact with the instinct hammered into me by years on the assault courses of the Schola Progenium, and turned, drawing my own las pistol. A moment later, Winifred hit the ground beside me, and I peppered the window above us with vindictive enthusiasm, blowing the head off a thick-set male from his shoulders. As he fell, I noticed a third arm growing from his right shoulder, tipped with razor-sharp talons. "How many of these freaks are there?" I asked rhetorically, as the barman who'd let us in emerged from the door and leveled a stubber at us. Winifred took him down with a snapshot to the gut before he could fire, and we looked at one another with grim understanding sparkling between us. "More than we can handle." More of the grotesques were emerging from the shadows of the alleyways, moving with a coordinated purpose that was all the more unnerving for taking place in complete silence. With a chill which raised the hairs on my neck, I realized that there were normal-looking humans among them too, carriers of the gene-stealer taint, doomed to birth more of these monstrous hybrids with their wills already warped by the telepathic influence of the brood. I recognized one of the administratum drones who passed us earlier, a piece of piping in his hands, advancing on us with murder in his eyes, a chilling contrast to the prissy bureaucrat of a few moments before. "Pull back," I suggested, suiting the action to the word and sprinting in the direction of the sector house, drawn to the promise of protection beneath the spreading wings of the Aquila on the facade, like a penitent to the confessional. Not that I've been anywhere near one since the Schola threw me out, and I hardly ever told the truth in one while I was there, but you know what I mean. Winifred was with me, stride for stride, and our las pistols cracked in unison, striking down the cultists who were angling across the mouth of the street to cut us off. She activated her personal vox as we ran. "Larrabee, break out the weapons, we're coming in hot." All I could hear of the reply was the faint echo of static that told me her earpiece was activated, but her expression was enough to keep me appraised of the other end of the conversation. "We've uncovered a stealer cult. Inform the divisional office and the local guard units." My voice caught for a moment. "No, he's dead. Just me and the commissar." I missed the next exchange because I was busy ducking a frenzied rush from a hybrid wielding a length of chain. I blocked it with a chainsword, slicing it through, and riposted with a desperate swing that took his head off. Good thing, too. It was remarkably ugly, with far too much tongue. When I regained my balance, Winifred was looking at me. "Are your men reliable?" Well, that was debatable, really, but under the circumstances, I'd expect them to act like the soldiers they were, so I just nodded. Winifred activated her vox again. "I'm the troopers." A pause. "I don't care how hungover they are, even if all they can do is remember which way to point the gun, they're better than nothing." "They'll do a lot better than that," I said, stung at the implied slur on the men I served with. True, they were rear echelon warriors rather than frontline fighting troops. Give them an earth shaker or two and they'd flatten a city block neat as you please, but small arms weren't really their speciality. On the other hand, they practiced assiduously on the shooting range. Mostu saw to that, as he did every other regulation, and Earlson at least was a pretty fair marksman, as I could attest from the mere fact that I was still breathing. And don't forget they'd fought off the Nids on Desolatia, so even if they weren't exactly battle-hardened veterans, they'd already proved they could fight up close and personal if they needed to. So, all in all, I felt pretty confident in their abilities. I hope so. Winifred took down the last of the cultists between us and the sector house, and we started across the open square towards it. Our boot soles rang on the flagstones, echoes rising from the facades of the encircling administratum blocks, and small chips of stone began to kick up around us, preceded by the distinctive crack of ionized air which accompanies a las weapon discharge and the deeper bark of a stubber or two. Despite myself, I turned to look behind us, loosing off a couple of shots myself in the vague hope of keeping our assailants' heads down, then redoubled my efforts to reach the sector house. My worst fears had been realized. The cultists had been joined by a handful of men in the uniform of the local militia, who were armed with standard-issue las guns, and several of the hybrids had produced personal firearms of one kind or another. There were more of them than I could have dreamed of. Dozens of twisted monstrosities crowding into the square from all directions, converging on us with a grim fixity of purpose that clenched my bowels. "Militia renegades!" I gasped, feeling the air begin to rasp in my lungs. I couldn't hold this pace for much longer, but to falter meant being torn apart by the mob of inhuman hybrids behind us. They surged on like a malevolent tide, untiring and implacable, uncannily reminiscent of the tyrannid swarms that had forged their foul purpose and sent them out to infiltrate the Imperium. "This is just getting better and better." Winifred smiled grimly and dropped one of our leading pursuers. The others didn't even falter, flowing around it like water around a rock. Another group was just clearing the corner of the sector house, angling in to cut us off from our refuge. A lasbolt, more accurate than the rest, caught the hem of my greatcoat, tugging at it like an importunate child. "Aim for the shooters," I counselled. If we couldn't at least throw their aim off, they'd have us cold in seconds. If they'd been proper guard troopers, we'd have been dead already, of course. I found myself thanking the Emperor for the habitual sloppiness of the planet's defense force, which, like most professional soldiers, I usually found so irritating. Especially while trying to coordinate with them on the battlefield. It went without saying that on the few occasions we'd been forced to cooperate with the local forces, Colonel Mostrew had been only too pleased to delegate this onerous task to me, and I'd had no choice but to comply with as much good grace as I could muster. Of all the varied duties of a commissar, I've always found liaising with local militia among the most irritating. We turned in unison, aiming as best we could, but under the circumstances, I didn't expect much. At the very best, we were only delaying the inevitable until our pursuers closed. But I've always found that when you truly believe you only have seconds left to live, each one becomes so precious, you become determined to eke them out for as long as possible, whatever the cost. We fired as one, expecting little effect, but to my astonishment, the renegade troopers were falling, breaking, and running for cover. "Cowards!" I bellowed, carried away with adrenaline and the reckless bravado of imminent death. "Stand and fight like men, damn you!" "Are you mad?" Winifred was staring at me in astonishment, and I whipped my chainsword up into a defensive posture, ready to take on the first wave of hybrids that was already leaping towards us, inhuman jaws agape. "Run, you idiot!" Only then did I realize that several of our would-be assailants were falling, bloody craters exploding across their chests, and the distinctive crack of las fire was coming from behind us now. Instinct took over once again, and I followed her advice, finding the square behind us littered with the corpses of the cultists who had tried to cut us off. "This way, Commissar! Hurry!" Jurgen's familiar voice urged me on, and as I looked up at the sector house, now tantalizingly close, I caught sight of him crouched behind one of the columns supporting the portico, a lasgun raised and spitting death at the horde of cultists behind us. A moment later, I noticed another muzzle flash and made out Earlson similarly positioned, picking off one target after another with smooth precision. He caught sight of me and grinned, no doubt enjoying himself hugely. Larrabee was by the doors, the blue of his custodes uniform standing out starkly against the rich polished wood, blazing away on full auto without even the pretense of expertise. But the crush of distorted bodies was so great, aiming wasn't strictly necessary. Wherever he pointed his weapon, hybrids and human cultists alike fell like wheat before harvesters. With Jurgen's encouragement ringing in my ears, I put on a final spurt, vaguely surprised to find that a small part of my mind was still able to appreciate the rear view of Winifred bounding up the steps a few meters ahead of me. And then, almost before my senses could register it, I was surrounded by the cool marble foyer of the sector house. I turned back to find Larrabee closing the doors, while Jurgen and Earlson backed through them, still firing on the frenzied mob, which was by now cresting the steps outside and bounding over their fallen comrades in a single-minded attempt to reach the narrowing gap. They almost made it at that. The door stopped, centimeters from closing, blocked by a chitinous arm, tipped by three scythe-like talons, which gouged a deep groove from the thick hardwood as it flailed around for purchase. The two gunners leapt to assist the constable, putting their shoulders to the wood, but even with all three of them straining every muscle, the sheer weight of the tide of bodies behind it began to force the doors open again. I slashed down with a humming chainsaw, severing the obscene limb that dropped to the floor, thrashing and leaking a foul-smelling ichor, and the door slammed to. Larrabee triggered the locking mechanism, and thick steel bolts slammed home, securing it behind us. What the hell did you think you were playing at out there? Winifred was glaring at me, a complex mixture of emotions on her face. Were you trying to get yourself killed? There was no point in admitting I'd been so far gone I hadn't even noticed our comrades had opened up a corridor. So I just shrugged. Well, you know, I said. Ladies first. The effect was quite gratifying, I have to say. She hugged me briefly, failing to find any words, and turned away, already assessing our situation like the professional she was. Earlson and Larrabee were looking at me with undisguised admiration, and I was suddenly sure, correctly as it turned out, that suitably embroidered reports of my gallantry and heroism would be all over the sector before the week was over. I turned to Jürgen, who was taking in the scene outside with his usual phlegmatic manner. "What's our situation?" I asked. "Fracked," Earlson muttered, before turning back to the nearest window, beginning to amuse himself by taking pot shots at the abominations outside. Fortunately, the custodians tend to the sort of caution I was about to require, and the place was constructed to withstand a siege quite comfortably. The windows were narrow and placed to provide excellent firing positions. "Pretty defensible," admiring him. "We could do with a couple of full squads to cover everything, though. We're spread pretty thin." "Might as well wish for a chapter of Astartes while you're at it," I said. But as usual, my aide was immune to sarcasm, and he just nodded. "That would be nice," he agreed. "Where are the others?" I asked. Jürgen gestured towards the rear of the building. "Milson's covering the back door. He found some grenades in the armory, and he's booby-trapping the entrance. Hokin's with him. Jarvik's up on the roof." "What about Nordstrom?" I asked. "Still sleeping it off?" "I don't know." Jürgen looked confused for a minute. "I thought he was with us." "A building this size, he could be anywhere," I said. Before we could speculate further, the sound of lasfire cut across the silence. Drawing the obvious conclusion, I glanced across at Earlson, but he was in the middle of reloading and looked as puzzled as the rest of us. "That came from inside." Winifred led the rush back towards the rear of the building. The firing intensified for a moment, then ended with a gurgling scream that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Too impatient to wait for the counter to retract, I vaulted over it, landing heavily, and found myself facing the door to the rear of the building, through which Jürgen and Larrabee had disappeared to fetch the others, what seemed like a lifetime ago, but which my chronometer stubbornly insisted had been little more than an hour. "Protect the brood!" Nordstrom appeared through the gap, a blood-stained combat knife gripped in his hand, his eyes as vacant as those of the infected humans outside. The full significance of the apparently trivial wound on his chest suddenly became clear to me. I sidestepped his swing, blocking reflexively with the chainsword, and took his hand off at the wrist. To my amazement, he didn't even slow down, spinning to strike at my eyes with the extended fingers of his other hand. I ducked my head just in time, feeling the impact against my skull, barely cushioned by my cap, and heard his fingers break an instant before the crack of a las pistol next to my ear told me that Winifred was still watching my back. As he fell, she ran past me, sprinting for the end of the corridor. A lasbolt took her in the shoulder, spinning her back into my arms. I glanced at the wound, noting in passing that it was already cauterized, so at least she wouldn't bleed to death, before handing her back to Larrabee. Milson was at the far end of the corridor, his lasgun aimed at us, a dozen or so frag grenades crudely wired to the thick wooden door behind him. A faint scrabbling sound betrayed the presence of our assailants beyond it, still determined to push through. Hokin's body was lying between us in a pool of blood, clearly beyond any medical aid. "Cease fire, you idiot!" I yelled. "It's us!" "I know." The emotionless timbre of his voice warned me what he was about to do, even before my conscious mind registered the blankness of his stare. "Back!" I yelled to the others, even as he detonated the explosives, blowing the thick wooden door to splinters and himself to perdition. A shrieking tide of malformed malevolence burst through the gap, jaws gaping, talons extended to rend and tear. A volley of lasfire from all of us blasted into the first rank, but those behind just kept coming, barely slowed by the obstruction of their fallen fellows. "Fire and movement!" It was a desperate gamble, but one we just made, taking it in turns to shoot down the front rank of hybrids while the rest retreated to the stairwell leading to the roof. Even Winifred managed to keep firing, her face pale with shock as Larrabee helped her up the staircase to safety. It was a close-run thing, mind, We'd never have got away with it if the corridor hadn't been so narrow. Even now, I break out in a cold sweat at the thought of how things could have gone if the monsters had been able to close a little faster, or our fire had been a little more attenuated. Up here, Commissar! I grabbed the proffered hand gratefully, Olsen hauling me clear of the stairwell, just as Jarvik lobbed a couple of grenades down among the seething mass of chitin, and Jurgen slammed the heavy steel fire door closed. The dull thud of the explosion shook the metal as I leaned against it, and Larrabee locked it closed. I gasped, the fresh air of the outside hitting my lungs like pure oxygen, leaving me momentarily giddy from the reaction. "They seem pretty steamed," Jarvik said, glancing over the side of the roof and taking a random pot shot into the crowd for luck. I followed his gaze, and the breath seemed to freeze in my throat. We were surrounded now by what seemed to be hundreds of the monstrosities, lapping around our flimsy refuge like the incoming tide round a sandcastle. In that moment, I knew we were doomed, that all we could hope to do was stave off the inevitable. "Look, sir!" Jurgen was pointing at something, a grin of imbecilic delight on his face, and for a moment I thought he'd gone mad under the strain. Then I saw it too, the unmistakable silhouette of an Imperial chimera, and behind it, another. It's the Cadians! Sure enough, the column of armored vehicles bore the crest of the Cadian 101st, an elite assault regiment that had just arrived in the sector from the victorious campaign in the north. Hard luck for them to be thrown straight back into the fighting, I thought at the time, but as it turned out, it was just as well they were the closest guard unit and the first to respond to the message Winither had ordered Larrabee to send. The unmistakable rattle of heavy bolters burst across the square like thunder, siding the milling abominations down where they stood. We joined in enthusiastically from our perch on the roof, pouring down fire from above, watching in undisguised relief as the tide of obscenity broke in disorder. The thudding and scrabbling against the metal door died away as the brood realized it was facing a far greater threat than us and turned to meet it. "Well done, Kai." Beavis looked at the gleaming new medal on my coat with barely suppressed envy. As usual, he was the only one present to use the familiar form of my given name, and from the corner of my eye I noticed Winither, her dress uniform augmented by a sling which made her look fascinatingly Amazonian, grin as she picked up on my thinly disguised
What
irritation.
table?
"Looks like you got all the fun again." "It wasn't the same without you," I assured him, straight-faced. I glanced across at Elson, who was looking surprisingly subdued, considering he was supposed to be another of the guests of honor.
Ooh, that table.
"I expected you to be a bit happier under the circumstances, Elson. Free drink, all the food you can eat." "I know. It's these." He fingered the freshly sewn bombardier stripes on his sleeve moodily. "They're kind of inhibiting." "Don't worry," I assured him. "Knowing you, I doubt you'll keep them for long." "Well, there is that," he said, looking markedly more cheerful and wandering off to investigate the buffet. "What the six of you did," Beavis persisted. "If you hadn't found the cult, they would have infected every guard unit on the continent eventually. And we'd have lost the war. It doesn't bear thinking about." "Then don't," I said. I was still getting reports in from the purges going on in practically every regiment on the planet. Dozens of men executed for the taint they carried without even having been aware of the fact. And it left a sour taste in my mouth. I turned to Winither, desperate for a distraction. "Care to dance?" "To begin with," she agreed.
Yay! Now let's see. That one's done. Let's see the next part.
Traitor's Gambit.
Editorial note. This is one of the longer fragments scattered throughout the Kane archive, and as it's reasonably self-contained, I've resisted the temptation to incorporate it into the more comprehensive account of his activities during this period that I am currently compiling. Amberley Vale, Ordo Xenos.
As I've mentioned before in the course of these memoirs, my life has held more than its fair share of surprises. One of the rare pleasant ones had been my appointment to the position of Commissarial Liaison Officer to the staff of the Lord General. Apparently at the instigation of Zyvan himself. We'd always got on tolerably well, and I suppose he liked the idea of furthering our acquaintance under more congenial circumstances. Of course, I still found myself dragged off to one war zone after another, but at least being attached to the upper echelons kept me away from the noise a bit more than hitherto.
Nope.
Of course, my duties still took me a lot closer to the battlefront than Zyvan usually ventured, and the nature of the posting meant that Amberly was able to find me more easily whenever she had a particularly life-threatening errand to drop in my lap. But I can't deny her more frequent appearances had a definite upside too.
I'm pleased to hear it.
So, by the early weeks of 990, life was looking pretty good to me. We just arrived in the Deepwater system, along with a naval task force and a couple of dozen troop transports, ostensibly to show the flag and reassure our loyal citizens that the forces of the Emperor stood ever ready to protect them from the rapacious ambitions of the Tau. Although, as usual, the aliens have managed to persuade a sizable chunk of the population that they were better off embracing the greater good and defecting en masse. At least the situation hadn't deteriorated as badly as it had done on Gravelax, but things were getting uncomfortable enough for the local governor to seem heartily pleased at our arrival. To my surprise, I was quite favorably impressed by the man the first time we met. I've come across a number of planetary governors in the course of my erratic progress around the galaxy, and on the whole, the ones who weren't incompetent were either corrupt, insane, or both. On at least one occasion sufficiently so to have mortgaged their soul and the world they administered to the forces of the ruinous powers. There have been exceptions, however, and Landon Hoy was definitely one of those. A vigorous man of about my own age, whose greying temples imparted an air of wisdom and gravitas to his bearing, and who ruled his fiefdom in the Emperor's name with what seemed to me to be a reasonable degree of competence and integrity.
Kane's age was almost a century by this point, although given the degree of vagueness about Kane's origins and the amount of time he spent traveling the warp, that's more of a best guess than an accurate estimate. One thing we can be certain of from this description is that, like Kane, Hoy had benefited from a juvenile treatment or two.
Unusually for a civilian, he'd been able to grasp the tactical implications of the situation when Zyvan and I pointed them out to him on our first, and as things turned out only, visit to the gubernatorial palace. As the name implied, Deepwater was an aquatic world, with no land at all to speak of apart from the occasional island chain, so most of the population lived in hive cities anchored to the seabed. From these routes, the spires soared into the air above, often for a kilometer or more, to form glass and steel reefs capable of withstanding anything the elements were capable of throwing at them. A warren of tunnels and mine shafts sprawled out from the underhives to pillage the rich store of minerals lying beneath the waves, and periodically threaten the occasional sump community with drowning when they breached. A hiver myself, I found the place a strange mixture of the comfortably nostalgic and the outlandish, savouring the salt tang in the air as an honour guard of Hoy's household troops escorted us through the tapestry-shrouded corridors towards our destination. A larger contingent of Zyvan's personal guard trotted in our wake, keeping them covered. The Lord General hadn't risen to his current eminence by being overly reckless, and was all too aware of how big a gift his sudden removal would be to the enemies of him on Earth. Hoy received us in a well-appointed room below the waterline, where couches upholstered in powder blue silk were arranged to give the best possible view of the fish swimming around the reef, beyond the thick sheet of armacris forming the far wall. The spectacle was stunning, but I was too seasoned a campaigner to have my attention diverted that easily, and shook the hand of our host with an easy assurance.
I'm stuck.
I thought that would best match the mental picture he undoubtedly had of the hero of the Imperium. He returned it firmly, then bowed formally to Zyvan. "I can't deny I'm pleased to see you," he said, reseating himself on a sofa and gesturing a servitor forward to offer drinks. I selected an amasec from the array of decanters on the tray, finding it surprisingly indifferent, but masked my disappointment easily. "The Xenoists have been gaining ground among the populace, in spite of everything we do to discourage them. If nothing else, your arrival means they can't keep spreading the lie that we've been abandoned by the Imperium." And you won't be, Zyvan assured him, clearly finding the Amasek no more palatable than I did. The Tau Empire had managed to annex several Imperial systems in the region over the last few years, simply because, with the growing menace of the Tyranid hive fleets, we hadn't had the resources to defend them properly. In fact, if the Nids hadn't been as much of a problem for them as they were for us, they'd probably have wrapped up half the sector by now.
Something of an exaggeration, but they'd certainly have made significant gains.
Enough was enough, and Deepwater was where we decided to draw the line. The resources extracted here were vital both militarily and economically. If it fell, we'd all be feeling the pinch. I'm glad to hear it, Hoy said, with a nod towards the pile of papers on a small table close to his elbow. They were too far away for me to read from where I was sitting, but I didn't need to anyway, as I'd authorized their release to him personally. It had simply been meant as a gesture of trust, and the idea that he'd actually bothered to read the material was as much a surprise to me as it clearly was to Zyvan. Especially as it seems you're needed in other systems too. That still remains to be seen, I said cautiously. The star cluster of which Deepwater was part of was far too vulnerable to a sudden Tau attack for my peace of mind. Or Zyvan's too, come to that. So the strategy we determined on was the old one of a mobile defense, moving from system to system as unpredictably as possible. The Tau couldn't know which system the fleet would be in next, and would have to mount an invasion force sufficiently powerful to overcome it wherever they tried. Even if we weren't there when they arrived, the existing defenses should be enough to bog them down long enough for our flotilla to respond and tip the balance in the Imperium's favor. We hoped. Of course, if our intelligence turned out to be wrong about the resources they had available, we'd be royally fracked. But I'd worry about that when the time came, if it ever did. At the moment, the protection of Deepwater is our highest priority. I'd be interested in any suggestions you might have, Hoy said, ignoring the Amasek and reaching for an unfamiliar drink at the back of the tray. He smiled. Have a Nagila? I'm afraid our local Amasek isn't up to much. Hardly anywhere to grow the grain, for one thing. I took the local beverage and sipped cautiously, finding it a great deal more appetizing than the contents of my abandoned glass. I thought briefly about asking what it was made from and decided I probably didn't want to know. Our first priority is to assess the state of readiness of the assets you already have in system, Zyvan said, as agreeably surprised as I was. He nodded at me. That will be Commissar Kane's job. Once he's done that, we can institute any additional training measures that seem necessary. Purge the outstandingly incompetent officers, raise any additional manpower the PDF requires, and garrison a guard regiment or two here to make up any deficiencies which may remain. He regarded the governor seriously over the rim of his glass. I trust you have no objection to that? None whatsoever, Hoy assured him. He returned his gaze to me. In fact, I'm due to begin a tour of the off-world Hebs and Void stations the day after tomorrow. If you'd care to tag along, I'm sure you'll find my yacht a good deal more comfortable than a military shuttle. Well, it would have been churlish to refuse, and the thought of spending the best part of a month cooped up in an Aquila with Jurgen wasn't exactly the most congenial prospect I could imagine. So I made a brief show of consideration and nodded. Thank you, I said, little realizing how wide of the mark my next 4 words were going to be. That sounds very pleasant. My first impression of the wave crest did nothing to dispel the fond illusion that, for once, I'd fallen on my feet and could expect more of a luxury cruise than a tour of inspection. My stateroom was as lavishly appointed as anything I'd come to expect since joining Zyvan's staff. Almost too much so. The mattress on the bed being so yielding that climbing into it was more like being swallowed by a patch of tangle moss than an attempt to rest. After one sleepless night, troubled by dreams of being digested, I instructed Jurgen to remove it and found the more utilitarian padding of the frame far more to my liking. He nodded and, to my relief, moved away from the grill of the circulator where he'd been basking in the frigid draft, allowing his remarkable body odor to roam the room freely.
Kane's aide was a Valhallan, and, like most ice worlders, found the temperatures most other Imperial citizens tend to favor sultry at best.
Jurgen wasn't exactly the most prepossessing soldier in the Imperial Guard. In fact, I'd seen troopers who'd been dead for several days and still looked more presentable than he did. That said, he possessed a number of qualities which made him the perfect aide, not the least of which was a literal-minded obduracy in following orders, coupled with an unshakable faith in my judgment, second only to his reverence for the Emperor himself. He'd saved my life on more occasions than either of us could remember, although I tried not to bother him with anything which involved counting above 10, as I suspected that might involve the removal of his socks. I suspected even an orc shopping. Mine was the same, he said, glaring at the offending mattress. Wouldn't have had a wink of sleep if I'd turfed it on the floor. In a small cabin adjacent to mine, common to the guest quarters, where it seemed to be assumed that the occupants would require their valets, maids, coiffurists, or whatever kept readily to hand. I hadn't had occasion to venture inside, but the glimpses I'd had through the doorway had left me in no doubt that Jurgen had made himself as much at home as he ever did in a Hrud's nest of abandoned meals, discarded underwear, and porno slates. I had no idea who was going to tidy up in there after we disembarked, but strongly suspected that whoever got the job would have severely hacked off their superior shortly before. Overstuffed mattresses notwithstanding, I found the bulk of the voyage as enjoyable as I'd anticipated. We spent almost a month ricocheting from one outpost to another, where Hoy would disembark to confer with the local administratum adepts, while I put the fear of the Emperor into whatever System Defense Force personnel I could find lounging about the place. In general, I have to admit, I was quite favorably impressed. They weren't up to the standard of Guard or Navy regulars, of course, or they'd have been swept up in the manpower tithes. But they were competent enough to give the tower bloody nose if push came to shove. Not for long, of course. They'd be overwhelmed in a matter of days, but the Blueies would know they'd been in a fight, and, Emperor willing, be weakened enough for our fleet to have the edge when we turned up to liberate the system again. Between outposts, we generally had 2 or 3 days coasting through open space, which were the next best thing to a holiday. I still had plenty of work to do, of course, remaining in Vox contact with Zyvan and keeping up to date with the latest intelligence reports, but as ever, Jurgen was an invaluable bulwark against the more onerous aspects of my job, deflecting most of the paperwork with his usual efficiency. That left me free to play the diplomatic game, mingling with the usual collection of aristocratic parasites and senior bureaucrats who accrete around a governor's household, and who were all gratifyingly aware of my unmerited reputation. By playing an adroit combination of the bluff old soldier and the modest hero, I was able to milk them for a fair amount of useful intelligence, which I duly passed on to Zyvan, and a couple of morsels of information about the most probable Tau sympathizers in positions of influence, which I sent straight to Amberley. Without doubt, though, the most agreeable aspect of the voyage was the chance to socialize with Hoy. He invited me to his quarters for dinner on several occasions, where Stein, his personal chef, demonstrated an ability with fish dishes bordering on genius.
Seafood being a staple of the deep-water diet, of course.
The meal over, we'd retire to the somewhat gaudy lounge where we'd play a game or two of regicide in front of the Armacrus wall, giving onto a spectacular view of the Emperor's domain, and I'd exaggerate outrageously about my experiences in the front line of its defense. It sounds a near miracle that you're here at all, Hoy said, knocking back his goblet of Nagila and glancing around for a refill. Like another? I glanced up from the regicide board, where I was on the verge of losing my 3rd game in a row, grateful for the distraction. I'd have preferred to get my tarot deck out, to tell the truth, but I had a feeling that the governor would consider that a rather vulgar pastime, and if he started getting competitive, I'd never be able to afford to match his bets anyway. No thanks, I said, considering the offer. Nagila was all very well in its way, but it had a slightly cloying aftertaste, and I was beginning to miss the cleaner flavor of my favorite tipple. I'll take an amasec this time. If you're sure, Hoy said, looking faintly surprised and signaling for a servant. Usually there were none around, as he dismissed them all from his quarters after dinner. Unlike most aristos I've come across, he was sensible enough to realize that servants are people too, and liable to gossip about anything they've overheard. But I'd have thought you'd prefer something a little better than what we've got to offer. I do, I said, knowing him well enough by now to be certain that he wouldn't mistake candor for a slight against his homeworld. And I've got a particularly fine bottle in my quarters. If Zyvan was aware that it was missing from his personal stock, he'd been too polite to mention it. As this is our last night before making orbit again, I went on, I can't think of a better time to share it. Hoy nodded slowly. Once we got back to deep water, our respective duties would make it all but impossible to spend a convivial evening together again, so we might as well make the most of it while we could. By all means, he agreed, and pressed the switch on the arm of his chair again. The servant seemed to be taking an inordinate amount of time to respond. Have your men bring it down? I stood, a little more carefully than I had anticipated. Nagila may not have been entirely to my taste, but there was no denying it was powerful stuff. I'll fetch it myself, I said. So far, I managed to keep Jurgen out of the governor's way, and felt it would be prudent if I continued to do so. Probably best, Hoy agreed, pressing the call button again with a hint of impatience. If he's anything like my staff, we could die of thirst before he got here. Quite, I agreed diplomatically, and slipped out of the governor's quarters. As the solid gold doors closed behind me, the palms of my hands began to itch. A presentiment I'd learned long ago not to ignore, even when, as now, there seemed no obvious reason for disquiet. Loosening my last pistol in its holster, I began to walk down the corridor, used by this time to the slightly springy sensation underfoot imparted by the luxuriant carpet. My footfalls were all but silent. I strained my ears for any sound out of the ordinary. I could hear nothing unusual, although that brought little comfort. In my experience, it's what you don't notice that kills you. The circulators were humming quietly, and the constant thrumming of the engines, felt through the bones rather than heard, was as steady as ever. That was when it hit me. Not a sound out of place, but the absence of one. Ever since we boarded, I'd been aware of the faint murmur of a human presence, mingling with the other noises. Now that nebulous amalgam of distant voices, the clattering tools and the footfalls of the lowly, toiling in the uncarpeted regions of the ship had vanished completely. Certain by now that something had gone badly awry, I drew my sidearm and loosened my trusty chainsword in its scabbard. Rounding the next junction in the corridor, I tensed, seeing a flash of movement in the distance, then began to relax. Hoy's servants were responding to his summons at last, 3 of them, the gold highlights of their livery flashing as they caught the radiance of the overhead luminators. I was just on the brink of hailing them when something about the way they were moving started my palms tingling afresh. They were spread out, like an infantry team advancing into hostile territory, the 2 on the flanks glancing down each side corridor as they approached it, while the 3rd kept his gaze on the main passageway ahead. I just had time to register the comm bead in his ear and the last pistol gripped in his hands when our eyes locked. The odds hardly seemed fair. 3 to 1 it may have been, but I've spent a lifetime fending off attempts to kill me, generally by things a great deal more formidable than a gaggle of civilian insurrectionists who barely knew one end of a gun barrel from another. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, just to make sure I wasn't misreading the situation, but the moment the point man stopped gawking me, he began to bring his pistol up, which just goes to show what a frat brain he was. I'd already got him in my sights and dropped him with a single shot before he could even come close to threatening me. The other 2 were a bit quicker off the mark, although neither seemed to have registered my presence until the snap of ionizing air from my lasbolt and the muffled thud of their friend hitting the carpet brought their heads round with identical expressions of stupefied astonishment. I couldn't take them both before they retaliated, though. They were too widely separated, so I cracked off a snapshot at the woman on the left, which, despite missing, made a nasty mess of some gaudy frescoes millimeters from her head, and dived for cover behind a pedestal supporting a marble bust of some dyspeptic-looking predecessor of Hoy's. The man on the right recovered first, returning fire with far more enthusiasm than accuracy, and going to ground behind a large ceramic urn, which my next lasbolt shattered most satisfactorily. I followed up with a second as soon as I could squeeze the trigger again, blessing the extra speed and steadiness my augmetic fingers gave me, and he collapsed among the shards, a bloody crater punched neatly into his torso. Seeing him fall, the woman turned and fled towards the dubious refuge of the corridor she'd been investigating, crossing half the distance in a couple of panic-lengthened strides before my next bolt took the back of her head off. I stood, slowly, making sure they didn't have friends within earshot, and walked towards the trio of corpses, wondering what the hell was going on. It would have been flattering to think that I was their intended target. The encounter had clearly been no more than random chance. If I hadn't had a sudden impulse to fetch the amasec from my quarters, I'd have still been sitting across the regicide board from Hoy, blithely unaware of whatever was happening. I raised a hand to my ear before belatedly recalling that I'd left my combead in my quarters, along with instructions to Jurgen that I wasn't to be disturbed for anything less urgent than the sudden appearance of a Tau battle fleet. The scapegraces who'd attacked me were all well past the point of being able to give answers, something a cursory examination made all too clear. And I was on the point of turning away when a faint hissing sound drew my attention to the leader's earpiece, which by some miracle was still functioning. I picked it up and listened with interest. "Yenis, where are you?" a female voice asked, not for the first time judging by the petulant tone beginning to creep into it. "Team 3 respond. You should have met Craven in the governor's quarters by now." "None of your people can answer at the moment," I said, the residual adrenaline buzz from the skirmish combining with the Nagila still sloshing around my system to override my more cautious instincts. "They're a bit too busy being dead." "Who is this?" The voice was sounding more curious than irritable now, and I had the sudden unnerving sensation of having attracted the attention of a predator, which I'd last experienced in the underhives of Hope Springs just before the gene stealers started coming out of the walls. No matter, I told myself, beginning to regret my moment of uncharacteristic bravado. Whoever was on the other end of the Vox link could hardly talk me to death. "Commissar Kane," I said, injecting a dash of the insouciant self-assurance I liked to project in my younger days whenever there were impressionable young ladies in the room.
And the rest of his life, too. Although, by this point, it was more habit than a serious attempt at seduction. I'd certainly have known if it wasn't.
"And you would be entirely unconcerned?" With withering scorn. Having survived the displeasure of a number of women over the years, including an Inquisitor, the heiress to a planet and a sorceress who came back from the dead as a demon.
Hardly the most flattering company to have been lumped in with.
I was singularly unimpressed. "You'll be dead soon enough." "Forgive me if this sounds a little ungallant," I riposted, "but I've heard that before." I was already moving as I spoke, jogging back to Hoy's quarters, alert for any sound betraying the approach of another squad of turncoat retainers. I didn't think the woman would be stupid enough to issue orders to the rest of her brigands on the frequency we were using to converse, but I kept the channel open anyway on general principles. "This is Roxwell." A new voice broke in after a moment, and I blessed the lack of imagination of the average civilian. The earpieces they'd been issued with were on a preset frequency, so it hadn't occurred to anyone to change them. "The engineerium secured." "Bully for you," I cut in, scenting the chance for a bit of misdirection. "Let's see how long it takes me to loosen it up again." I hadn't the slightest intention of going anywhere near the place, of course, but with any luck, my shadowy enemies would be so taken with my hollow reputation that they'd dig in there, expecting me to burst through the door, diverting enough reinforcements to pretty much give me the run of the rest of the ship, which, now I came to think about it, wasn't all that big, at least compared to the warp-going transports I'd spent so much of my life aboard. Besides, it was clear from the first thing I'd overheard that Hoy was either a target or involved in a conspiracy, and on the whole, the former was far more likely. If I could get to him before Craven, whoever the hell that was, with any luck he'd be able to give me some answers about whatever was going on. As I approached the governor's quarters, I slowed my pace, checking the charge in my las pistol's power pack and drawing my chainsaw. The golden doors were open, and a cape of chill presentiment settled itself around my shoulders. On entering, a single glance was all it took to confirm my worst fears. The governor was dead, most of his torso seared away by an energy bolt of quite staggering power. I'd seen the damage done by plasma weapons often enough to recognize it, and felt an even stronger sense of foreboding than before.
Dang it.
Whoever Hanar's people were, they were well-resourced. Plasma weapons were rare, to say the least, and the vast majority of them firmly in the hands of the Emperor's faithful servants. Palms tingling anew, I edged further inside, keeping my back to the wall and an eye on the door. My erstwhile drinking companion had clearly been taken by surprise, but hadn't gone down in a fight. There was another body sprawled across the carpet, dressed in the plain utilitarian uniform of a member of the ship's crew, A small, neat hole punched through his forehead, confirming the suspicion.
I bet this goes to the fog
that
fisher
the
later.
index finger was a digital weapon of some kind. I swept the room rapidly, but the mere fact that my head was still attached to my shoulders was enough to confirm that the assassin had been alone. Besides which, if he had any companions with him, they would undoubtedly have recovered the weapon he dropped when he took his final revenge. It was actually hard to tell who had first. The final involuntary muscle spasm could have triggered either weapon, but given the manifest accuracy of Hoy's shot, my money would have been on the governor beating his assailant to the punch. Just his hard luck that Craven had been armed in the way he was. A las or auto pistol might well have missed Hoy altogether, but the plasma bolt had expanded as it travelled. I bent to pick up the assassin's handgun from the floor, rescabbarding my chainsaw to do so, although I'd have kissed an orc before I let go of my las pistol at that point. The handgun's smooth surface, devoid of devotional icons and the seals of sanctification bestowed by the tech priests, bespoke its unhallowed origins, and I was unable to suppress a shudder of revulsion as I closed my hand around it. It was of Tau origin. I'd seen enough of their Xenos tech over the years to be certain of that, and a grim conclusion began to force its way into my thoughts. Hoy's assassination was almost certainly a decapitation strike, intending to sow confusion and discord in advance of a Xenos invasion, which meant that an all-out attack on the Deepwater system must be imminent. I took a deep breath, forcing down my spiraling fears. I knew where the Vox room was from my periodic reports to Zyvan. All I had to do was reach it and warn the fleet. Of course, I'd have to make my way through an indeterminate number of Xenos sympathizers to get there, but I'd faced far worse odds than that before, and I was still around to tell the tale. Despite my misgivings, I tucked the plasma pistol into the sash at my waist before leaving the room, as gingerly as if it was a Greech egg.
A life form native to the Bandit system, most notable for its acidic blood, which is capable of eating through ceramite armor in a matter of seconds. Its eggs are full of the stuff, which makes handling them something of a risky business.
It was clear evidence of the Xenos involvement that would convince even the most skeptical of Zyvan's underlings, and I was sure Amberley would appreciate the chance to do whatever it is Inquisitors do with unhallowed artifacts.
That depends on the individual, of course. I tend towards safe disposal, but there are radicals out there unbalanced enough to actually use the things. Bad enough in my own order, but a truly terrifying prospect where the Malleus is concerned.
I was on the point of leaving when I noticed that the prostrate assassin had a comm bead in his ear as well, and, struck by an idea, retuned the one I'd confiscated from the late and unlamented Yanis. Craven, are you receiving? Hannah's voice came through almost at once, and I smiled grimly to myself as I slipped out of the room. No harm in dividing the opposition up even further, I thought. By the time they responded, I'd be long gone. Hello again, Hannah, I said. Craven's dead. Can I take a message? I trotted along the corridor, keeping an eye out on more insurrectionists, but the whole ship seemed eerily quiet and still. I soon found the reason for that. As I rounded a corner, I almost stumbled over the corpses of a couple of ladies' maids, evidently gunned down as they tried to flee, and any thoughts I might have had about offering terms of surrender to the pirates evaporated abruptly. Civilian casualties are a sad inevitability of warfare, but any true servant of the Emperor tries to avoid harming his subjects as much as possible. Casual butchery like this was the mark of creatures like the orcs or debased followers of the ruinous powers, and for the first time I began to appreciate just how ruthless my foes were in pursuit of their agenda. The unfortunate women were just the first of many I discovered as I made my way through the passageways. Servant and plenipotentiary alike had been slaughtered where they stood, or more frequently, as they ran, or tried to make a fight of it. The guest quarters, where most of the local aristocracy and adepts had been sleeping when the insurrectionists began their coup, was a charnel house. I approached my own stateroom with a rising sense of foreboding, fearing to find my aide among casualties at any moment, but to my relief, both my own room and Jurgen's were empty, with the faint residue of his body odor remaining to confirm that he'd been there at all. Where he'd gone? I had no idea, but his lasgun was missing as well, which was a good sign. Like any guardsman, he'd as soon be parted from his right arm as his weapon, and I was certain he'd be prepared to use it. As reassured as it was possible to be under the circumstances, I picked up the bottle of anisette from my quarters and slipped it into my greatcoat pocket after a quick restorative gulp. So fine an example of the distiller's art undoubtedly deserved better. I didn't have time to savor it properly, and I was damned if I was going to leave it for a bunch of murdering brigands. Then, as ready as I was ever going to be, I set off for the Vox room. Having been aboard the Wavecrest for the best part of a month, I had a reasonable idea of the layout, which my innate sense of spatial awareness in enclosed environments had helped to sharpen. Ever since Kari had conducted me through the service passages of the Hand of Vengeance during the Orc attack of earlier, I had cultivated the habit of making a passageways giving access to these areas on every vessel I'd travelled aboard. So I had a rough idea of how they interconnected as well. On a troop ship or military vessel, these would be guarded by security codes, which I generally found some way to get my hands on, but in the case of the Wavecrest, the opportunity hadn't arisen, so I supposed I'd be stuck in the main corridors. That was irksome, as I was sure Hanar's people would be searching them diligently by now, but for an old hiver like me, playing Hunt the Sunbright in a maze of passageways was second nature, so I was certain I'd still have the edge. It all seemed to go fine at first. I knew the Vox room was 3 decks up from the guest quarters near the bridge, so I headed for the nearest stairwell. There were lifts too, of course, but I'd got far too much sense to box myself in, waiting to be gunned down like a trackie.
A Valhallan fowl, proverbially too stupid and to offer any challenge to hunt.
I'd be keeping them covered if I was Hanar, and from what I'd seen, whoever she was far from stupid. As I approached the stairwell, I heard voices. It seemed I'd read my unseen enemy right, and she had enough manpower spare to cover the stairwells too. Drawing my chainsword again, I flattened myself against the side of the corridor and peered cautiously around the angle of the walls. Sure enough, there was a reception committee waiting for me. 2 more fellows in the livery of servants, another crewman, and a 4th individual whose presence came as a real surprise. I'd last seen him with Cotillion in the ballroom a couple of nights before, where he droned on about the economics of fish ranching and the extent of his family estates at tedious length, before asking what I now realized had been a few artfully ingenious questions about the Imperial Guard regiments embedded in our task force, which I declined to answer, of course, in favor of embroidering a few of my own past exploits, much to my retrospective relief. It seemed that the conspiracy included members of the deep-water aristocracy, as well as the lower orders, and from the easy manner in which the fellow was conversing with his social inferiors, the pernicious notion of egalitarianism held out by the Tau had evidently found converts even among those with the most to lose from its adoption. I observed the group of traitors for a few more moments, before concluding that any attempt to get past them to the stairs would be doomed to failure. They had room to scatter in the wide landing, and when it's time to attack, they could separate and pick me off. At least one of them was a combead too, and I couldn't see the others clearly enough to be sure that he was the only one. If any of the heretics was able to box a warning before I killed them all, the net would be closing around me faster than you could say the Emperor protects. I was on the verge of slinking away when it suddenly dawned on me that the fellow with the visible earpiece appeared to be engaged in an urgent conversation, although none of his companions seemed to be responding. Intrigued, I tried retuning the set in my ear again and was almost instantly rewarded with the sound of Hannah's voice. It seemed she learned fast and was switching frequencies in an attempt to keep me from listening in. "Hold your position," she was sounding a little miffed that no one had reported killing me by now. "He can't get off that deck without using one of the stairways or elevators, and when he tries, we'll have him." "Can you get another team down here to help sweep the corridors?" the aristo asked, confirming my suspicion that more than one of the group was in the comnet. "Roxwell says he's already set the fusion reactors to overload, so his group aren't needed in the engineering anymore." A sliver of ice seemed to enter my spinal cord as he spoke. It seemed that the traitors were preparing to cover their tracks by destroying the Wavecrest entirely, making the loss of the governor look like a tragic accident. I'd seen spacecraft reactors breach before, although in most cases the catastrophe had been triggered by a lance or torpedo volley. I knew that once they'd carried out their dastardly plan, there would be nothing left of the yacht beyond a cloud of superheated plasma, burning like a brief miniature sun, consuming everything within a couple of kilometers of the explosion point. To hell with the Vox room, I thought. It was time to start looking for an escape pod. I withdrew carefully around the corner and considered my options. The launch racks were all on the deck below, on the reasonable assumption that anyone on the upper levels would head for the shuttle hangars in an emergency, which meant I had to get past the pickets after all. Suppressing the impulse to join in the conversation this time, I listened to Hannah's reply with considerable interest. "No," she said to my immense relief. "Roxwell stays put. They're already welding the doors shut down there. Kane said he's on his way to retake the place, so he can waste his time trying to get in if he ever makes it that far. Even if he does, he'll be waiting." I digested this with some puzzlement, wondering how they intended getting out before the reactor blew if they were sealing the room, before the full extent of their fanaticism finally dawned on me. They weren't going to. This was a suicide mission. At least for some of them, and for all I knew, the entire cabal was intending to go down with the ship. Which simply didn't make sense. They'd achieved their objective, so far as I could see. Why not stick around to enjoy it, and get a pat on the back from their alien masters? Well, as I've remarked on more than one occasion, heretics are all deranged by definition. Though this was more the kind of thing I'd expect from chaos worshippers than followers of the so-called greater good. I gave up trying to understand it in favor of staying alive, which has always been one of my favorite occupations. However you looked at it, things were grim. I was just on the verge of chancing the stairs anyway, and trusting to the Emperor to watch my back in the regrettable absence of Jurgen, when the initiative was abruptly wrested out of my hands. "There he is!" someone shouted, an instant before a lasbolt detonated against the wall, far enough from where I was standing to induce apoplexy in the average Imperial Guard small arms instructor. I spun round, already bringing up my las pistol, to see a trio of crewmen charging towards me with all the finesse of a rabble of Gretchen, brandishing handguns of their own as they came. I put a lasbolt through the one who'd shot at me as he was marginally in front, and to my immense satisfaction, he tripped the others as he fell. I was about to pick them off before they could rise again when a stubber round ricocheted from the wall behind me. I turned to find the party from the stairwell rounding the corner, the light of murder in their eyes, and brought my pistol up while there was none. By sheer bad luck, I went between cross passageways, nothing to my right or left but the burnished metal walls. There was nothing else for it but to trust in the Emperor and try to keep them rattled enough not to shoot straight. So I bellowed, "Wah!" with all the gusto of an orc and charged at them, chainsword swinging and depleting the power pack of my las pistol as rapidly as I could pull the trigger. Of course, I didn't have a hope of accuracy under the circumstances, even a skilled marksman finding it all but impossible to hit a moving target while running.
A skilled marksman. Kane most certainly was, despite his frequent protestations to the contrary.
But him on Earth must have been looking over my shoulder after all, because one of my wild lasbolts caught the renegade Aristo on the upper arm just as he pulled the trigger of another Tau-made plasma pistol, making the shot go wide and punching a molten hole in the wall of the corridor. I was still a few strides short of being able to bring the chainsword into play, though, and to my chagrin, the sight of it wasn't causing them to falter as I'd hoped. It's a formidable-looking weapon, and generally an untrained opponent doesn't have the nerve to face one without flinching, being able to picture it shearing through their own tender flesh all too vividly. Untrained they may have been, but they were fanatics, prepared to die for their cause, and they held their ground, bringing their weapons on aim, each one certain that if he fell, one of his friends would kill me an instant later. Not only that, the two survivors behind me would be climbing to their feet by now, preparing to shoot me in the back. As I've remarked before, even the slimmest chance is better than no chance at all. So I did the one thing I hoped they wouldn't expect, diving forwards into a roll, hoping to close the distance and take the legs out from under them with the humming blade before they could readjust their aim. No sooner had I hit the carpet than a blizzard of lasbolts scorched the air above me, the distinctive overlapping crackle of a lasgun on full auto echoing from the enclosing walls. As I rose to my feet to find my putative targets making a mess of the expensive floor coverings with their bodily fluids, I breathed a heartfelt sigh of relief, despite the assault on my nostrils, which the act of inhaling now entailed. "Well done, Jurgen," I said, timely as ever. Warned by the sudden shifting of his aim, I turned and dispatched one of the crewmen behind me, a steward I vaguely remembered handing me a drink at a couple of social gatherings, and who I now found it hard not to resent having tipped, while Jurgen took out the other with a single shot to the head. "You're welcome, sir," he said as phlegmatically as ever, and glanced at me. What do we do now? Escape pod, I said. I'd been in enough of them to know that they all carried Vox sets as a matter of course, and with the wave crest about to blow up under our feet, I'd feel far happier warning Zyvan about the imminent Tau attack from the relative safety of open space than fighting our way through to the Vox room. How did you manage to avoid getting killed with everyone else? I hid in the service passages, Jurgen said, leading the way to an open access hatch in the wall which I'd barely noticed before. I reckon they wouldn't expect us to think of that. He looked at me a trifle quizzically. I thought you'd be doing the same. How did you get the access codes? I asked, not bothering to waste any more time on being surprised. Jurgen's ability to scrounge the most unlikely things bordered on the preternatural. And if anyone had been able to get their hands on secure information like that, it would have been him. His expression grew even more puzzled. Access codes? He repeated blankly, and it belatedly dawned on me that the locking plate such hatches generally had was missing. Apparently it simply wouldn't occur to the kind of passenger the Wave Crest usually carried that the utility areas even existed, let alone that they might be entered. Never mind, I said, drawing the hatchway closed behind us, and tried not to breathe too deeply in the confined space. How did you find me? Jurgen shrugged. They've killed everyone else, so I just listened out for more shooting. It had evidently never crossed his mind that I wouldn't have survived, and I found the notion curiously touching. We need to get to the savior pods, I said. They're overloading the reactor to cover their tracks, and I don't know how long we've got before it blows. Most people would have found that little piece of information somewhat disturbing, to say the least, but Jurgen simply nodded as though I'd been commenting on the weather. Better get a move on then, sir, he agreed. We double-timed it in what I hoped was the most likely direction to find a vertical shaft, and found one with gratifying speed. I was beginning to think that the Emperor was looking out for me after all, although I have to admit I was doing my best to make things easy for him. As I reluctantly stowed my weapons and Jurgen slung his lasgun across his back, I looked around apprehensively. I knew some of the crew had joined the heretics, which meant that they'd be unlikely to overlook the warren of service tunnels we now found ourselves in. Have you seen anyone else in here? I asked. Not really, Jurgen said, to my immense relief. There were a couple of traitors passing through a wall, but they didn't notice me. They seemed a bit busy. For doing what? I asked, and my aide shrugged. Messing about with stuff, he said unhelpfully. Like the cock boys do, but without the incense and the chanting. More Tau influence, I thought. They don't have any respect for the machine spirits, just bullying them into compliance instead of invoking their aid with the proper rituals, and their human dupes tend to behave in the same way. Why their mechanisms don't just stop working out of sheer pique is beyond me, but perhaps they have other methods of propitiating them.
A question the Adeptus Mechanicus would very much like to have answered. A few Magi have gone so far as to suggest that the machine spirits of the Tau Empire might even be subverted and turned against their masters if they could somehow be persuaded that the servants of the Imperium would accord them the veneration they deserve. But, so far, no practical method of attempting the experiment has been proposed.
We'd better move quietly then, I said, at least partially reassured that the notion of anyone crossing from the passenger areas to the service passages seemed to be unthinkable to the renegade crew members. I climbed down the ladder we'd found as quickly as I could, stepping from it into a low-ceilinged corridor lined with cabling. There was a body down here too, a junior engine seer, judging by her robes, so it seemed that not all the crew had been in on the mutiny. Jurgen joined me a few seconds later and glanced around, unslinging his lasgun. "Which way, sir?" he asked, certain, as always, that I'd have the answer. "Down there," I said, indicating a passageway I was certain would take us to the savior pods and leading the way at a run. Despite my innate paranoia and almost a century of discovering that when things appear to be going well, it's just because you haven't noticed the real threat, I began to feel cautiously optimistic. Even if the savior pods were guarded, the two of us would certainly be able to overcome any resistance, and I reached out to open the hatch leading to the corridor with a rising sense of confidence. Not enough to overcome my cautious streak, which was beginning to kick in again now the Nagila was wearing off, so I kept an ear out for any stray traitors who might still be wandering around. I was still listening to the comm-beat I'd confiscated too, switching frequencies at random, hoping to pick up more chatter. But it seemed that Hannah had
How did I
finally
even
given
do
up
that?
playing that game in favor of complete vox silence. Something I hoped meant that they were too busy to worry about me anymore, although I was too much of a realist to believe it. We emerged into a wide gallery with one of the armor-cross walls I seemed to have been so fond of, and I was relieved to find no sign of anyone's presence. No one living, at any rate. The bodies of a young couple were sprawled across one of the padded seats lining the Hullwood side of the concourse, evidently interrupted in the middle of a romantic tryst. The luminators were dim here, to allow the full splendor of the stars to be appreciated, and their bluish radiance cast a chill pallor across the faces of the slaughtered lovers. Despite the urgency of our errand, I found myself hesitating for a moment, scanning the starscape anxiously for any specks of light which might be moving, betraying the presence of marauding Tau battleships already inbound, even though I knew the effort would be futile. If things had got that bad, Zyvan would have mobilized the fleet in any case, warned by the Auspex traces of the invaders emerging from the warp. Well, let them come and be damned, I thought.
Alright, so
Once Jurgen and
crap.
I had raised the alarm, they'd find themselves coasting blithely into a trap, and serve them right for the cowardly curs they were. So thinking, I led the way towards the launching racks at a rapid rate, my stride broken only by the occasional need to hurdle another cadaver, alert for any sign of guard, but to my surprise and relief, there didn't seem to be one. There was a small group of corpses near the furthest of the pods, which was hardly a surprise. It wasn't hard to picture them being gunned down as they attempted to reach safety by launching themselves into space. A couple of paces behind me, Jurgen sniffed loudly. "Something smells funny," I said, oblivious as usual to the irony. "Plasma discharge," I said, recognizing the mingled odors of charred meat and ozone I'd scented in Hoy's quarters, and a tingle of unease brushed through me. How many more of the heretics had those damned weapons? There was no more time to worry about that, though, because I'd reached the nearest savior pod with a hearty prayer of thanks to the Emperor. As I glanced inside, however, disappointment kicked me in the gut. The interior was a mess, wrecked beyond all hope of use. The Vox and the launching mechanism melted into slag by a volley of plasma blasts. "This one's the same," Jurgen reported, with a cursory glance at the next in line. "And so's this." "Check them all," I said, convinced that it would be futile, but clinging to the faintest shred of hope as I always did. There might still be something we could do, or salvage, and if the worst came to the worst, we'd just have to break into the engineerium, take out the heretics guarding it, and hope we could find some way of undoing whatever it was they'd done to turn the Wavecrest into a massive bomb. As we reached the last pod in the line, though, Jurgen turned to me with the slight nod he generally employed when he was pleased about something, but thought it beneath his dignity to display overmuch enthusiasm. "This one's all right," I said. "Good," I replied, hardly able to seem less cool than my aide, and stepped round the huddle of corpses impeding my progress. As I did so, I glanced down, and my palms prickled anew. This was definitely not right. They'd all been carrying weapons, the same mix of stubbers and las pistols I'd seen the heretics favor, so they couldn't have been innocent victims as I'd first assumed. But the manner of their deaths was unmistakably the work of one of their own. Well, whatever internecine feud had erupted between the traitors was no concern of mine, so I followed Jurgen into the pod. As I did so, my foot clanked against a couple of holdalls someone had left lying on the floor, and fearing a booby trap, I stooped to investigate. To my surprise, it was stuffed full of the kind of expensive trinkets the Wavecrest was littered with. Small gold statues, gem-encrusted data slates, a devotional cogwheel from the Engineer's Chapel of the Omnisire cast in platinum, that kind of thing. Between them, the two bags must have held a small fortune. "Strap in," I said, taking no further interest in the find now that I was sure it was harmless, but I might as well have saved my breath. No doubt remembering the uncomfortable manner in which we parted company from the hand of vengeance, Jurgen was already fastening his crash webbing, his lasgun neatly stowed at his feet. Unlike the savior pod we'd inadvertently commandeered on that occasion, which had been commodious enough to take dozens of survivors, this one was cramped, intended for a mere handful, and the narrow seats certainly hadn't been designed with armed guardsmen in mind, let alone a commissar with a chainsword and pistol holster. I couldn't strap myself in without taking off my weapon belt, which I did reluctantly, but kept everything as close to hand as possible. Unfortunately, the padding on the chair was as extravagantly yielding as the mattress I'd discarded, and I sank into it so deeply
Mother.
my fingertips could barely reach my weapons. No matter, I thought, and raised my hand to punch the launching button, which the artificer had been thoughtful enough to incorporate into the armrest of every seat. Before I could activate it, however, a middle-aged woman in the robes of an administratum scribe appeared in the hatchway, lugging another bundle of loot. Her eyes widened as she took in our presents, and she dropped her burden to draw one of the Tau pistols from the recesses of her robe in a single fluid movement. I couldn't press the button with her standing there. If she was caught by the closing hatch, the pod wouldn't launch, and if she wasn't, and it did, she'd gun us both down before we could fight free of the crash webbing and reach our weapons. So I smiled instead, projecting an air of calm assurance in the hope of seizing the initiative. "You must be Hannah," I said, as though we'd simply run into each other at a social gathering. "I am," she agreed, trapped by convention into responding rather than shooting me straight away. "And you're Kane." Her expression flickered a little as she got her first full-strength whiff of Jurgen, and a trace of surprise appeared on her face. "Who's he?" "Gunner Jurgen, my aide," I said. "Quite a resourceful fellow." "Evidently." Her eyes took in each of us, emotionless and calculating. "Any more of you evade this sweep?" I shrugged. "Who knows? I doubted it, but it wouldn't hurt to give her something else to worry about." "No matter." Hannah echoed the gesture. "Anyone else on the loose will go up with the ship and your precious Lord General." "Zyvan?" I began in surprise. "What does he—" Then the coin dropped. "Oh, I see. That's why you're staying on board. You still need to steer this tub." "Quite." The ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth and subsided again. "The wave crest's a gigantic torpedo aimed right at your flagship. When it's been vaporized and your task force is leaderless, the Tau will be able to liberate the whole cluster from Imperial oppression." "I'm sorry to disappoint you," I said, masking my horror at the idea with the ease of a lifetime's dissembling, "but Zyvan's death won't make a blind bit of difference. In the military, we have this thing called the chain of command. The senior surviving officer will simply take over where he left off. But he wouldn't have Zyvan's flair for leadership and the unflinching confidence of the men under his command that the Lord General enjoyed. And there was no doubt about it. If this heinous plan succeeded, we'd all be in deep trouble." "We'll see," Hannah said, gesturing with the barrel of the alien weapon she held. "Now, if you'll both get out of those seats and out of the pod, I'll be on my way." "Stay where you are, Jurgen," I said, suddenly realizing why we were both still alive. "She daren't fire that thing in here in case she fracks up the equipment." "I'll risk it if I have to," Hannah said, a trace of uncertainty cracking her imperturbable mask. "I doubt that," I said, allowing a measure of scorn to enter my voice. "I wonder how your comrades would feel if they knew their leader is nothing more than a coward and a common thief." "I'm nothing of the kind," Hannah said, her voice so tightly controlled that I could hear the anger behind it scrabbling to get out. "I'm quite an exceptional thief, and if those idiots are so keen to lay down their lives for the greater good, fine, they're welcome to. I intend to be around afterwards to reap the benefits." She forced a mirthless laugh, which didn't suit her at all. "Why shouldn't I be well paid for my efforts? How much have you ever got from putting your life on the line all those times you've been boring the parasites about ever since you came aboard?" "I get the standard pay specified by the Munitorum for a commissar of my seniority and length of service," I replied, comfortably aware of how much we seem to have in common after all. "Plus accommodation when required." I smiled slowly, an idea beginning to form. It was risky. If I didn't do something soon, she'd kill both of us anyway. I gestured with my hand towards my head. "And the hat and the sash, of course. No commissar worth the name would be seen dead without those." I let my hand come
Come
to
on.
close in the cloth around my waist. I smiled in my "Then this must be your lucky day," she said, her fingers tightening on the trigger. I fired first. A plasma bolt from the weapon I'd picked up earlier, vaporizing the front of my sash and scorching the legs of my trousers before taking the traitorous adept high on the right side of her chest, searing away her shoulder and upper arm. She staggered back, shrieking as her forearm and hand, still clutching the butt of the Tau pistol, thudded to the deck plates.
Jurgen, go!
I shouted, relieved to see that she'd cleared the hatch. My faithful aide had already punched the button on the arm of his chair. I just had time for one last glimpse of Hannah lunging desperately for the pod again, despite her appalling injuries, before the hatch clanged shut and the engine ignited, throwing us clear of the wave crest with a surge of acceleration, which almost made me feel grateful for the excessive padding of the seat.
What do we do now, sir?
Jurgen asked, once we'd got the Vox to work and reported the situation to Zyvan, who'd assured me that the matter would be dealt with. Sit tight and enjoy the fireworks, I suppose, I said, as a small nova flared briefly among the starfield, the wave crest detonating far short of her intended target as the flagship's crew made the most of the chance for some unexpected target practice. It would take a few hours for the pod's machine spirit to guide us home, and I fished the bottle of Amasec out of my pocket speculatively. I don't suppose there are any glasses.
Stealth. Hey. Stealth. Stealth. Only when I run that does it ring. Ring, 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 ring. Yeah, pretty brave for a guy that was just scared the whole time with me. Ugh. Stealth. Gosh dang it. How did I get here? Alright, yay, I found it. I'm a goose. I do the destruction. Oh, I beat it. Okay. I was wanting to see, I was guessing I could fill up like a bottle. And a goose as the goose. He's paranoid. A lot of people. Carriage picnic. Left. Well, dang, I got a lot to do. I guess I'll see y'all in the next episode. Bye for now. Thanks for joining me today. Y'all have a good night.